On the morning of the 18th of November 2019, a 54-year-old detective named Musi McKay stood in a long, slow-moving line. He was waiting to get into a courthouse in the city of Ikapa, South Africa. Musi was an investigator, a good one, and today he was on court duty for a very violent robbery case that was, at long last, finally going to trial. The robbery itself had happened nearly 6 years earlier, a lifetime ago in police work. Back in 2014, a group of armed men had stormed into a couple's farmhouse just outside of the city. It was a brutal, terrifying home invasion. The men beat the couple severely before they ransacked the home, making off with everything they could carry: electronics, jewelry, a collection of firearms, and other valuables. It was Musi and his team who had worked the case tirelessly. They eventually identified, tracked down, and arrested the criminals responsible. And in a stroke of good police work, they were even able to recover some of the stolen items. Now, as he stood in that line, Musi was holding one of those recovered items. It was a piece of evidence he was scheduled to present in court today. He had done this kind of thing countless times over his long career. Stand in court, present the facts, show the evidence. It was part of the job. But today, he felt a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that was different. It wasn't just the trial prep. He was juggling other active cases, mentoring junior detectives who looked up to him, and he was feeling every one of his 54 years. Musi wasn't the young, energetic officer he used to be. He was getting close to retirement age, and the weight of all his obligations was starting to press down on him. The biggest source of his fatigue, though, was this robbery case itself. It had been an excruciatingly long and complicated process. There were an unusual number of delays, legal challenges, and procedural hurdles that had dragged it out for 6 long years. It had taken so long to bring this case to trial that the very piece of evidence Musi was now holding had actually been returned to the victim couple. The system figured they might as well get to use their property again until the court finally got its act together. Getting the case to this point had been a marathon, not a sprint, and it had drained him. But Musi and his team were absolutely determined to see it through. The men they had arrested weren't petty thieves. They were incredibly violent. They needed to be behind bars, for the good of the public. They had beaten the couple so badly that both of them had ended up in the hospital with serious injuries. It was a miracle they hadn't been killed during the home invasion. Justice, however delayed, was essential. As Musi finally reached the front of the line and entered the courthouse, he passed through the security checkpoint. He gave the guards a nod, hoping they were on high alert today. In his experience, violent offenders, like the ones on trial, often had equally violent friends, especially in this region where this kind of crime was unfortunately common. It wasn't unheard of for associates or gang members to try and disrupt court proceedings, sometimes even retaliating against police officers or the prosecution right there in the courthouse. But the security check was smooth. There were no suspicious people loitering, no signs of any trouble. Musi felt a small measure of relief as he made his way down the corridor and into the designated courtroom. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and saw that the room was already full. The defense team was there, the jury was seated, and the public gallery was packed with observers. He walked towards the front of the court. Musi went over and took a seat at the prosecution table. He would stay there until it was his turn to approach the judge and present the state's case, which would include him formally introducing this piece of evidence. As he got settled into his chair, he placed the evidence carefully in his lap. He turned and gave a quick, subtle wave to the prosecutor, a woman named Adelaide Ferreira-Watt, who was sitting next to him at the table. She was deeply focused, reviewing her notes one last time. Musi had worked with Adelaide on several cases before. They had a good working relationship, built on mutual respect. In his mind, she was a total professional, sharp, and dedicated. He knew that with her leading the prosecution, their chances of getting a conviction were very strong. Adelaide looked up, saw his wave, and returned it with a brief, confident smile before her eyes went back to the papers in front of her. Musi took another slow look around the courtroom. Everything seemed quiet, orderly. There was no sign of any gang members or friends of the accused trying to intimidate anyone. The air was still and tense with anticipation, as it always was before a major trial began. Musi just hoped it would stay that way. He hoped the trial would go smoothly and end with the verdict he and the victims had waited 6 long years for. A few minutes later, the judge entered, called the court to order, and the trial officially began. Adelaide stood up, straightened her robes, and began to present the case for the prosecution. At that very moment, despite waiting all these years to finally get here, Musi didn't feel a surge of adrenaline or excitement. Instead, a profound wave of exhaustion washed over him. It was almost like relief, the feeling that the final chapter was beginning and his long involvement was almost over. The courtroom was also quite warm, stuffy from all the bodies packed inside. The combination of the heat and his deep fatigue was potent. Before long, his eyelids started to feel heavy, like tiny weights were attached to them. He fought to keep them open, to focus on Adelaide's opening statement, but her voice began to sound distant, muffled. His head felt like it was filling with cotton. Eventually, his head slumped over to the side, his chin resting on his chest. And right there, in the middle of the trial he had worked so hard for, Musi MK dozed off. At first, everything was fine. For a couple of minutes, he slept, and nobody seemed to notice or care. The trial continued on around him. But then, a sudden, loud scraping sound ripped through the quiet of the courtroom. It was the sound of dozens of wooden chair legs being dragged across the floor all at once. The jarring noise woke Musi up abruptly. He was startled, his heart pounding in his chest. As he jolted awake, disoriented and confused, the evidence he had been holding in his lap slipped from his grasp. It clattered onto the floor beneath the table. He blinked, trying to get his bearings. He was embarrassed. Had anyone seen him sleeping? What was that noise? He saw that people were getting up, moving around. He looked down and saw the evidence on the floor. His first instinct was to get it back before anyone noticed his blunder. He ducked under the table, scooped the item back up, and as he was sitting back up in his chair, he heard a deafening bang echo through the courtroom. It was sharp, explosive, and utterly out of place. He still had no idea what was going on. The room had erupted into chaos. And then he heard a scream coming from his right. He turned his head and realized the scream had come from the prosecutor, Adelaide. Musi looked over the table and saw her on the ground. She was clutching her hip, and a dark stain was rapidly spreading across her clothing. Her hip was gushing blood. She had been attacked. That loud bang he had heard, it was almost certainly a gunshot. Musi's mind instantly jumped to his earlier fear. The criminal's friends must have stormed the courthouse. They had gotten a weapon inside, and they had attacked them. They had shot Adelaide. His training kicked in. Were there more shooters? Were there other attackers in the building? Musi, who had only been awake for about 30 seconds, was still trying to process the frantic scene. He began scanning the courtroom, looking for a perpetrator, a gunman, anyone who looked like they were part of an attack. But he saw nothing of the sort. All he saw was the chaos of terrified people trying to flee the room and a few brave individuals rushing towards Adelaide to try and help her, to render aid. There were no attackers. There were no gunmen. There was just panic and confusion. For a moment, Musi just sat there, almost paralyzed by the shock of it all. He was still shaking off the fog of sleep, trying to make sense of the scene in front of him. He looked around the chaotic courthouse again, his eyes darting from face to face. No gunman, no perpetrator, nothing. And as that fact settled in his mind, it could only mean one thing. A cold, horrifying realization began to creep into his mind as he looked down at the object he now held in his hands. To understand what really happened inside that courtroom, you first have to understand a specific detail about South African police procedure. Normally, as in most countries, after evidence is collected from a crime scene, it's carefully examined, cataloged, and made safe. Then, it's transferred to a secure exhibit room where it stays under lock and key until it's time for trial. This ensures the integrity of the evidence and the safety of everyone in the court. However, in South Africa, there can be exceptions to this strict procedure, especially in cases with extreme delays. And this trial, as we know, had taken almost 6 years just to get started. Because of that immense time lag, some of the evidence recovered from the robbers' hideout has been returned to the original victims. The shotgun that was stolen from their farmhouse was one of those items. The idea was that they should be allowed to have their property back while the justice system took its sweet time. When the trial was finally scheduled, the couple had returned that particular piece of evidence to the police that very morning. Detective Musi McKay had been the one charged with bringing it to court. He was responsible for holding on to it. But in the rush of preparing for the long-awaited day, a critical step was missed. Musi, or someone on his team, had failed to double-check the evidence, to re-examine it, and make sure it was safe to be brought into a crowded courtroom. Sometime after Musi had fallen asleep, the judge had announced a short recess. The loud scraping of chairs that had startled him awake was simply the sound of everyone getting up to take a break. But for Musi, deep in sleep, the sudden noise was like an explosion. He had sat up suddenly, confused, and in that disoriented moment, he dropped the evidence onto the floor. And it turned out that was the worst possible thing that could have happened. Because that particular piece of evidence was the shotgun recovered from the robbers. When Musi, in his panicked, instinctive state, saw the shotgun on the ground, he had one thought: get it back before the judge or prosecutor saw that he'd fallen asleep and dropped it. He reached down quickly to scoop it up. But the shotgun, because it had never been re-examined after being returned by the victims, was still loaded. And as Musi hastily grabbed it from under the table, his finger accidentally hit the trigger. The gun fired. The blast hit Adelaide Ferreira-Watt in the hip, severing a major artery. The wound was catastrophic, and it would prove to be fatal. Musi was so confused by the chaos and the suddenness of it all that at first he didn't even realize he had been the one to fire the gun. He just scooped it up, heard the bang, and immediately thought they were under attack. It was only when he scanned the room and found no gunman, no other explanation, that he looked down at the shotgun in his own hands. And he realized it was aimed in the direction of where Adelaide had been standing. He must have been the one who shot her. In the end, Musi MK pleaded guilty to culpable homicide and negligence. For his role in the tragic death of his colleague, he was ordered to serve a 6-year prison sentence. However, that sentence was fully suspended. On the morning of the 14th of July, 1912, a 21-year-old athlete named Francisco Lazaro stood in his hotel room in Stockholm, Sweden. He was carefully getting dressed, preparing himself for the most important day of his life. Francisco was in Sweden to run the marathon in the Olympic Games. A marathon is a grueling long-distance race covering exactly 26.2 miles. For the world's most elite runners, it typically takes between 2 and 3 hours to complete. Francisco was representing his home country of Portugal. And this was a very big deal for everyone back home. It was Portugal's very first time participating in the Olympics, which meant Francisco was one of only a handful of Portuguese athletes at the Games. And out of all of them, Francisco genuinely believed he stood the best chance of bringing home a medal. He had a chance to do something truly historic, to put his country on the sporting map. Realistically, he wasn't even that nervous. He knew he was an incredible runner, one of the best in the world. Even though he was only 21, Francisco had already won 3 major marathons in Portugal. He was a star back home, a national hero in the making. But he also knew that winning on the world stage at the Olympics would require him to be more prepared than he had ever been in his life. So that's exactly what he had done. He had trained for months, pushing his body to its absolute limit. He had recently undergone a full medical examination to confirm he was in peak physical health. And he had even spent weeks thinking about the little details, the small ways he could give himself an edge over the competition. He thought about what to eat, what to drink, what to put in his body, and even what to put on his body. He knew that even the smallest thing, like a shirt that wasn't breathable or eating something that sat too heavily in his stomach, could be the difference between winning a gold medal and finishing in last place. The margins at this level were razor thin. Any little edge he could find, he was going to take it. So now, on the morning of the race, Francisco spent the next hour meticulously putting on the specific clothes he had selected and eating a perfectly balanced, light meal of carbohydrates and protein. It was all part of the plan he had mapped out. He had also been warned by race officials that it was supposed to be extremely hot on race day. But Francisco actually saw this as an advantage. He was from Portugal, where it often got much hotter than in a place like Sweden. He was used to the heat. He felt he knew how to protect himself from the sun and how to use the sweltering weather to his advantage against runners from cooler climates. Before he knew it, Francisco was ready. He left his hotel room and made his way to the stadium to compete in the Olympic marathon. A few hours later, around 1:45 in the afternoon, Francisco walked out into the middle of Stockholm's massive sun-drenched stadium where the race was set to begin. As race officials directed him and the 67 other competitors to their places at the starting line, Francisco was feeling incredibly confident. So confident, in fact, that he called out to a nearby reporter who was covering the event. He told the reporter, with a grin, that he was going to be the winner, famously declaring, "I win or I die." As Francisco and the other runners took their spots on the starting line, they were standing in the direct sunlight, and it was unbelievably hot. In the shade, at the edge of the stadium, the temperature was already 90 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a sweltering, oppressive day. As Francisco looked up and down the line of his competitors, he saw that many of them already looked flushed. Their faces were red, and they were sweating profusely. They didn't look ready to run 26.2 miles in this heat. They looked overwhelmed before the race had even begun. But Francisco wasn't overwhelmed. He was prepared. In fact, he wasn't even sweating. As he stood there, waiting for the race to start, he could hear the roar of the thousands of people who had packed the stands. For a moment, he just stood there, taking it all in, appreciating how special this moment was. The marathon was a major event at these Olympics. The stadium was completely sold out. Even the King and Queen of Sweden were rumored to be somewhere in the crowd, watching. And as Francisco stood there, soaking in the atmosphere, he felt a deep certainty that when this race was over, all those people in the stadium and people all around the world, even royalty, would know his name. Just then, he heard the announcer's voice boom over the loudspeaker, telling the runners to take their marks. Francisco felt a surge of adrenaline. A hush fell over the crowd. He and the rest of the racers stopped moving, tensing their bodies, waiting for the signal. A few seconds passed in complete silence, and then, bang, the starting gun went off. Francisco and everyone else lunged forward. There was a bit of jostling as all the competitors surged off the line together, and Francisco found himself pushed back towards the middle of the pack. Right off the bat, he was a little surprised by how quick the pace was. But he still wasn't worried. He had studied the course maps extensively, and he knew he would have his chance to get out in front later on. This particular marathon route was very flat, but Francisco was used to competing in Portugal, which had much more mountainous and hilly terrain. So, he was sure that once the other runners inevitably started to get tired, especially from the blistering heat, he would still be feeling fine. He could make his move then. So, Francisco decided to hang back, conserve his energy, and wait for the right moment as the pack of runners moved out of the stadium and onto the dirt roads beyond. For the next hour and a half, he stuck to his plan. He kept his pace steady, running comfortably in the middle of the group. He knew that at some point, runners would start falling off as the heat and the distance wore them down. He would be able to make his way up through the field then. He wasn't rushing. He was just waiting, biding his time, staying confident. In fact, as he was keeping his pace, he was even able to give another quick soundbite to a reporter who was covering the race from the side of the road, telling her that he was feeling great. For the first half of this marathon, Francisco Lazaro felt like he was running the race of his life. It was as if everything in his training, his preparation, and his background had led him to this moment, to excel here on the world stage. He was consistently and easily moving past other runners. Some of them were really struggling in the heat, clearly not used to it. He saw some who had stopped running altogether, bent over with their hands on their knees, gasping for air. Others were just sitting on the side of the road, unable to get up. Basically, everything was playing out exactly the way Francisco had expected it to. He was slowly but surely making his move towards the front of the pack. However, as great as this race was going for him, something changed at around the 19-mile mark. All of a sudden, he just felt really off. His legs suddenly felt incredibly heavy, like they were made of lead. A few minutes later, his vision started to get blurry at the edges. Francisco kept running, telling himself he was fine, that this was just late race fatigue kicking in. And to be fair, it is pretty common for marathon runners to say that the real halfway point of the race isn't at 13 miles, but at around the 19 or 20 mile mark. That's the point where your body really starts to struggle. That last 6 miles is notoriously brutal. So he tried to rationalize it, telling himself that this was normal, that this happens when you hit mile 20. As Francisco worked as hard as he could to just put one foot in front of the other to keep going, he began telling himself that this pain was worth it. At the end of this, there was a stadium packed with people who would be screaming his name. He was still making such great progress. He could still win this race. But then, just a little bit later, his legs went from feeling heavy to completely giving out from under him. He slammed hard onto the hot, dusty ground, and then his whole body began to convulse. Within the hour, at a local hospital, an emergency doctor greeted a crew of Olympic medical staff as they wheeled a man in on a stretcher. They quickly explained that the man's name was Francisco Lazaro and that he had collapsed in the middle of the marathon. The doctor wasn't particularly surprised by this. He knew the Olympic paramedics had been swamped all day, helping other marathon runners who had gotten sick from the oppressive heat. However, as soon as this doctor began to examine Francisco specifically, he knew that this case was different. It was much, much more serious. The other patients he had seen that day all had relatively mild symptoms, things like excessive sweating, general fatigue, and dizziness. They had all been easily treated by giving them water and cooling them off. But Francisco was twitching and convulsing uncontrollably. He was shouting deliriously, claiming that he had won the race. The doctor rushed him into an exam room and immediately took his temperature. When he saw the reading, he knew the situation was critical. It was 106.7 degrees Fahrenheit. A body temperature that high was often fatal. Francisco's organs were likely already shutting down. The doctor yelled for nurses and other medical staff to bring in water and ice, anything to cool him down. But Francisco did not respond to any of the hospital's treatments. As the hours passed by, his condition actually got worse. The doctor and his team worked tirelessly through the night, treating Francisco and trying to stabilize him. But the next morning, Francisco Lazaro died. After his death, that doctor just could not shake the feeling that something was off about what had happened. Yes, heat stroke can definitely be deadly, and Francisco had presented with a very severe case of it. But lots of other runners had gotten heat stroke during that same marathon, and all of them had recovered and were ultimately fine. So the doctor decided to run some tests on Francisco's body to see if maybe there was something else going on, perhaps an underlying illness or some other factor that was to blame for his tragic death. And when the doctor finally got those test results back, the answer made Francisco Lazaro famous all over the world. Remember, Francisco had put an incredible amount of thought into how to prepare for his big race. He trained hard, he ate right, he chose the perfect clothes, and critically, he took very specific measures to protect himself from the heat, which he knew was going to be a major factor. And at first, it seemed like all the measures he had taken had paid off. When he looked down the starting line and saw all the other runners pouring with sweat, their faces flushed, it seemed like they were already exhausted. But not Francisco. He wasn't even sweating. But not sweating in that kind of extreme heat was actually a very, very bad thing. Sweat is the body's natural and essential way of cooling itself down. When sweat evaporates from the skin, it takes heat with it. So Francisco's lack of sweat was actually a giant red flag, a sign that his body was in serious danger. And it was all thanks to what he thought was his secret weapon against the sun. It would turn out that Francisco, so determined to be prepared, had gone out and found what he believed would be the best and most powerful sunscreen imaginable. It was a substance called suet, which is a type of hard animal fat that's typically used in cooking or for making things like candles and soap. It's also sometimes used in skincare products because it's rich in nutrients. Francisco believed that because suet is so thick and waxy, it would act as a powerful barrier, protecting his skin from the intensity of the sun. So, just before the race, he had slathered a thick layer of suet all over his body. What he didn't anticipate was that this layer of fat would work far too well. It was so thick and non-porous that it clogged every pore in his skin. It created an impermeable seal, preventing anything from passing through, including his own sweat. And without any way to cool itself down, Francisco's body essentially turned into a furnace. As he ran for miles in the scorching heat, his internal temperature just kept climbing higher and higher, effectively cooking him from the inside out. The weekend after Francisco Lazaro's death, the Olympics held a memorial service for him. Over 20,000 people attended to pay their respects. It probably wasn't the kind of fame he had dreamed of when he stood on that starting line, but Francisco's name is still frequently referenced in Portugal today. When someone looks sick, pale, and bedraggled, the Portuguese sometimes say that they look like Lazaro. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. As dawn broke on the 5th of February, 1990, 57-year-old Laverne Pavlone stood in her Wilsonville, Oregon apartment kitchen. The small apartment smelled like coffee, even though the sun wasn't up. Morning stillness was Laverne's favorite time. The only time she had the flat to herself and could breathe was then. She resided there with boyfriend John Sosnovsky. John always left before morning to take his bus to work at a local mill, where his shift started early. Laverne was relieved every time the front door closed behind him, like a weight had been removed. Since John wasn't home, Laverne could pretend her life was normal. She might act safe. She was merely acting for herself. Indeed, John was violent. He was severely physically abusive, especially when drunk, which was almost constantly. His fury was a regular storm in their home that Laverne had to navigate. Her first husband died of cancer. After his death, she met John when she was lonely and weak. She didn't realize John's true nature until she was already ensnared in his web. 10 long years. 10 years of treading on eggshells, hiding bruises, and dreading his key in the door. Laverne still lacked the guts to quit. She was afraid of what he would do if she attempted. He made it plain what would happen. Thus, she felt absolutely trapped at home. She made coffee and sat at her modest kitchen table that morning. As usual, she unwrapped the local paper. Her first sight was a large black and white photo of a young woman on the front page. The woman smiled, looking vibrant in her 20 seconds. The snapshot accompanied a murder story. About 30 miles northeast of Portland, it happened. Tanya Bennett was the victim. The smiling girl was Tanya Bennett. The article said she was viciously battered and strangled with a rope. Highway side, her body was left. Laverne got a chill reading about Tanya's discovery. That article indicated her body was dumped near a prominent scenic viewpoint. This place was familiar to Laverne. She'd been there before. About 1.5 miles from the lookout. Her mental image of the region was excellent. Laverne sat there, her coffee cold, her eyes flitting between the words on the page and Tanya's beaming face. As she watched, a thought formed. She felt strangely familiar with this horrific deed. She initially couldn't place it. She continued staring at Tanya's eyes in the photo. Then her brain switched on. She was sure she knew who did this when everything fell apart. John, her boyfriend, had probably killed this woman. Laverne got up from the table, even though she loved her quiet mornings. Her hands shook. She contacted the cops from her kitchen's wall-mounted phone. Laverne felt like her heart would explode after hanging up the phone. She was shivering uncontrollably. She took a huge risk. She didn't know if the police could arrest John with the information she gave them. If not, John would likely learn she called if they questioned and released him. He discovered she betrayed him and told police she thought he was a killer. If that happened, his abuse would worsen. She had no idea what he would do to her. Her view was that there were only two outcomes. She could either sever her relationship with John and send him to prison for a long period, or she could wind up like Tanya Bennett, another dead girl on a highway. On the morning of February 16, Detective John Ingram sat on a couch in a spotless Wilsonville, Oregon living room. He and his partner were in Laverne's apartment. As the lead investigator on the Tanya Bennett murder case, Ingram spoke with Laverne, who was sitting on the couch opposite him. She appeared anxious. She couldn't sit still, fidgeted, and gave him and his buddy coffee and water 3 times. Something was clearly on her mind. Ingram knew this woman had tipped a week before. Susan told the dispatcher she thought her boyfriend, John Sosnowski, killed Tanya. Now, Ingram was here to hear the whole story. He wanted every detail she could give because his case was hopeless. This Laverne tip was their only lead. Tanya's body was located on a grassy slope near the highway, where vehicles could see her. Yet, Ingram and his crew found no eyewitnesses. Several people claimed to have seen Tanya at a bar the night she disappeared. Nobody could describe the man she was with. Just a man. Ingram and his companion followed the rules. They contacted everyone who knew Tanya. They canvassed her neighborhood door to door. They interviewed her family, co-workers, and acquaintances. Despite that, they had no suspects. The crime scene provided scant evidence, making matters worse. They had no useful fingerprints, physical evidence, or forensics to identify a killer. In this clean apartment, Ingram was betting everything on Laverne. He hoped she would give him the case-opening key. He tried to smile at her to reassure her. "When you're ready, tell me what you know. Explain why you think John killed Tanya." Laverne initially squirmed in her seat. It was obvious she was nervous. Ingram advised her to breathe deeply and relax. He told her that was okay, they wanted her narrative. "Finally," she said with a trembling voice. She informed them John had come home late the night of the murder, possibly around 1 or 2 in the morning. He immediately entered the bathroom and showered. She said this was unusual. John didn't take 2 morning showers. It wasn't his habit. Laverne didn't think much of it at the moment. My understanding came the next day. They were at a local tavern when she overheard John. She heard John brag about murdering Tanya Bennett at the pub. He detailed how he picked her up at a truck stop, killed her, then drove her body to the highway by the Columbia River Gorge to dump her near that gorgeous viewpoint. Ingram and his companion looked at Laverne as he told the story. It surprised them. Laverne effectively overheard a confession. Her details matched what the cops knew. Tanya was observed late at night with an unknown male. Yes, her body was recovered near that gorgeous overlook. Although the body's location had been reported, hearing it as part of this confession was powerful. Perfect poker face, Ingram kept his face neutral. He nodded and calmly advised Laverne to keep on and tell him everything. So Laverne continued. She said she was afraid to speak up. John frightened her. She called him a violent alcoholic who abused her often. She stated this helped her believe his confession. That John could kill someone didn't surprise her. Violence was a daily threat to her. She was terrified he would murder her if she told anyone. So she hid this dreadful secret for days. But then she saw the newspaper article. Tanya seemed young and innocent in the photo. Laverne said she felt she owed the girl to speak up, no matter the risk. Ingram's mind was racing. If Laverne was right, this was a major case break. This may solve everything. This may have been Tanya Bennett's complete narrative. However, as an experienced detective, he understood he only had one woman's story. Even though she was convincing, he couldn't trust her. He needed tangible proof. So he requested Laverne to let him search the apartment. When Laverne nodded, the two investigators got up and started work. The detectives followed Laverne down a small hallway to the master bedroom. Once there, she stood by the doorway and let the men work. The detectives divided instantly. Ingram's colleagues started on one side of the room and Ingram on the other to maximize efficiency. Ingram presented a list of items they wanted to locate that could link a suspect to the crime site. A little denim swatch was crucial. It was Tanya's pants' front buttoned part. This portion was missing when they found her body. Interestingly, it was cut out cleanly. It made Ingram suspect the killer took a trophy or keepsake. Ingram didn't find the denim patch after several minutes of digging through the bedroom. At first sight, he saw no connection between John and Tanya. A cardboard box with old documents sat in the corner, so he went there. The random letters and receipts were sorted by him. He found it then. He took out a damaged scrap of paper. A handwritten message was there. "Good piece, T. Bennett." Ingram froze. He instantly summoned his partner. His partner looked down at Ingram's note as they crossed the room. Both realized the significance. T. Bennett must be Tanya Bennett. This was huge. They glanced at each other and thought the same. John needed to be talked to immediately. The door opened as they exited the bedroom and walked to the front door to leave the flat. The gateway was manned by John Sosnowski. Detective Ingram was at the sheriff's interrogation table an hour later. John sat across. Although he was confused, John appeared calm for a man who had just found two detectives in his bedroom. Ingram introduced himself and explained why they were at the flat when John entered. John seemed astonished, but didn't argue. He readily consented to answer questions at the station. However, Ingram was an experienced detective. He realized that cooperation didn't prove innocence. Sometimes it implied the reverse. Ingram passed John a Tanya photo across the table. He asked if he knew her or was involved in her murder. John didn't rage, not denying it. He didn't seem alarmed by the inquiry. He said he didn't remember after looking at the picture. Ingram then showed him the T-written note they found in his bedroom. "Good piece, Bennett." John glanced at the page and wasn't sure if he wrote it. Simple, direct questions needed. Simple, direct responses. Ingram was suspicious that John couldn't answer them clearly. The interview continued as usual. No matter what Ingram asked, John would just give these vague, non-committal answers. He struggled to answer yes or no questions. Ingram was struck by John's nonchalance during the interview. He pretended to talk about the weather while being questioned about a terrible murder. This was no time for laziness. This was a time to be honest and defend yourself. Despite his gut sense and intense suspicion of John, Ingram realized his sole proof was circumstantial. A bizarre note and girlfriend tale. It was insufficient to arrest him for murder. They sought concrete proof linking John to Tanya. After the weird interview, Ingram groaned and told John he could leave. 4 days later, Ingram's desk phone rang when he arrived to work. He was astonished to hear Laverne's voice when he answered. Before he could ask why she was phoning, Laverne said she found something in her car that morning. She believed he needed to see it. and when she told him, Ingram instructed her to stay and he would be right over. He went to find his partner after hanging up the phone. His heart raced as he drove to Laverne's flat. The past several days were frustrating. No fresh evidence proved John was their killer. One piece of evidence was lost. The note in John's box of papers was useless. Their forensics lab couldn't identify John's handwriting, so they couldn't prove he wrote it. Based on what Laverne told him on the phone and what she found in her car, Ingram was almost certain this was the break he had been waiting for. Ingram and his partner met Laverne in her garage within an hour. All eyes were on her car's trunk. Laverne told Ingram she kept her car and life spotless. Her car and apartment were clean. Nothing was out of place. A little denim swatch was in her car trunk when she went out that day. She was certain she hadn't put anything there. With her suspicions of John and his link to the murder, she immediately thought she should report it to the police. As they gazed into that trunk, Ingram and his companion felt struck. The trunk's clean carpet held a little denim square with buttons. It matched the denim they were secretly seeking. A crime detail was kept from the public. Outside the investigation, no one knew the killer took Tanya's jeans portion. They found it in their primary suspect's girlfriend's car. This needed to be their break. That was Tanya's jeans denim. The call by Laverne was correct. This was huge. Naturally, Ingram understood they had to follow process. A lab test would be needed to determine that the denim swatch matched Tanya's jeans when she died. It could have been a coincidence from Laverne or John's jeans. But the conditions were too ideal. It felt like winning the lottery. Ingram watched his companion use tweezers to gently place the swatch in an evidence bag and seal it. They assured Laverne they would examine it immediately and contact her. Ingram reviewed their findings at his desk the next morning. They felt wealthy at this time. After locating the denim, they summoned John back for a polygraph test the night before. He failed totally. In his report, the test administrator stated that John knew what happened to Tanya. Ingram awaited one more piece of the puzzle. He awaited the lab's confirmation that the fabric matched. Once he got the call, they might arrest John. Then his phone rang. He grabbed it immediately. It was Lab. Ingram straightened his chair, anticipating good news. The other technician sounded down. He told Ingram that Laverne's automobile denim swatch didn't match Tanya's jeans. It wasn't hers. Ingram was stunned. He sat silently. The idea that they located the same unique denim cut in their prime suspect's residence by chance seemed absurd. Denim swatches from the front of jeans weren't common. It was too specific. There must be more to this story. Ingram attempted to figure out why the swatch was in her car, but nothing made sense. The only plausible reason was denim planting. As the thought hit, Ingram felt shocked and frustrated. He felt like he was starting over after thinking he was close to solving this case. He knew his next stop. He needed another Laverne conversation. Later that morning, Ingram and his colleague sat in Laverne's living room again. Laverne sat across from them, worried. But this time, Ingram would do things differently. He would punish her more. He knew her previous story was false. After sitting down, Ingram asked her directly. He stared her in the eye and asked if she planted that denim in her car. As soon as he said that, Laverne's face fell. After quivering her lower lip, she cried. She sobbed and apologized. She admitted to doing it. She chopped up an old pair of jeans and put the buttons in her automobile. She lied about finding it to get enough proof to arrest John. She was frightened when they let him leave after the first interview. She knew John killed Tanya. He had mentioned it to her. She wanted the cops to hold him accountable because he was dangerous. Ingram could tell she was sincere as she spoke. This woman was clearly afraid of John and feared he was a murderer. Even if planting evidence was wrong, he wanted to believe her motive. She had a major problem with her story. He knew Laverne was still concealing things. because without inside knowledge of the crime site or other facts, she could not have planted that exact denim cut. Missing something. Why did she arbitrarily choose the front button fly of a pair of jeans to plant evidence? The pic seemed too detailed to be random. When he asked Laverne how she knew to cut that piece, her energy changed. The crying ceased. Sadness and regret vanished. It was replaced by hesitation. She seemed unsure how to react. It appeared she was caught. Then Laverne inhaled. She looked at Ingram and said, "I lied. You're right. My story about planting evidence was false." However, she claimed she lied out of fear. She worried the cops would arrest her if they learned the whole truth. Then Laverne detailed what she said happened to Tanya Bennett. Laverne alleged John called her the night Tanya was murdered. He sounded frantic. He informed her he was in trouble and to meet him at the bar. He instructed her to bring a shower curtain. Laverne said she didn't ask questions because John scared her. So she did as he said. She drove to the bar with a shower curtain from their bathroom. John was in the parking lot when she arrived. He stood over a corpse. It was Tanya. She lay unmoving on the cold pavement. Shocked, Laverne said. She had no idea what to do. She helped him. She helped John lift Tanya into her car trunk. The shower curtain she brought was wrapped around her. They drove to the highway and discarded her body at the picturesque overlook. Laverne's story darkened as she spoke. She later admitted that Tanya was alive when she arrived at the parking lot. She claimed Tanya was barely surviving. Laverne restrained Tanya's neck with a rope at John's request as he sexually attacked her. Laverne reported Tanya stopped breathing when he finished. Ingram was stunned as he listened. This gentle, soft-spoken elderly woman was suddenly telling him she actively engaged in the sexual assault and murder of a young woman. It was hard for him to comprehend. Ingram only thought, this can't be real. Laverne's claim fit. It clarified everything. It explained John's cagey interview answers, failed polygraph test, and, most crucially, how Laverne knew about the denim. She knew what area of Tanya's trousers to cut out and put as phony evidence because she and John had cut them originally. Despite this life-changing revelation, Ingram wanted to be sure this horrific, detailed account was true. And he knew how to prove it. The next day, Ingram drove his police cruiser. Laverne sat in the back, peering out the window, while his partner was in the passenger seat. They were driving northeast of Portland on the freeway. When they reached where she and John dropped Tanya's body, Ingram told Laverne to tell him. The newspapers had reported the body's broad location, but not its actual position. Ingram understood that if Laverne could pinpoint the place, she was telling the truth. Ingram's heart rate increased as they approached the spot. He maintained his speed. He didn't slow down or signal their approach. He kept driving straight, waiting for Laverne to speak. Laverne didn't say a thing as the cruiser drove by Tanya's body. They continued driving silently for a few minutes. Disappointed, Ingram was. This story seemed like another falsehood. Laverne suddenly spoke from the back seat. She said, "Hold on. Turn around." Ingram found a space to turn the car around, and they headed back. This time, Laverne yelled out as they passed the crime scene, the slope where Tanya was found. She claimed that was her location. "Stop." Ingram looked at Laverne as he pulled over to the shoulder. She stared out the window at the body's location. They exited the automobile together. Laverne crossed the road and pointed down the grassy slope to where Tanya had been found. Ingram was astonished. Laverne was honest. Her choice of location would have been difficult without having been there before. She must have participated. Ingram felt they had all they needed as they got back in the car. The evidence was sufficient to arrest John and Laverne. She had come forward, but now she would pay the price. Just 16 days after Laverne made her first anonymous contact, John Sosnowski was arrested on February 21. Laverne Pavlone was arrested 5 days later. Both were charged with murder. Laverne's trial began 11 months later. Laverne sought to amend her tale again. She sought to retract her statement, saying she hadn't done anything. The jury didn't believe her. She received a life sentence for murder. 2 months later, John received the same sentence, life in jail. The case should have ended there. But Detective Ingram couldn't stop thinking about it for 3 years. He kept thinking about Laverne, John, and Tanya Bennett. Though Laverne had done wrong, he felt weird pity for her. She was clearly controlled by John and afraid of him. But more than that, Ingram had this terrible, persistent sensation that they had messed something. Ingram was in his office one March 1994 afternoon when his desk phone rang. The prosecutor handled Tanya's case. The prosecutor said they received a bizarre Tanya murder letter. The prosecutor explained the letter's contents, making Ingram queasy. Ingram was correct to worry. The legal system botched this case. He felt loose and incorrect about Laverne. Their star witness was not a nice older woman terrified of her abusive lover. She had not spoken the truth despite the implications. That was not her tale. She lied about practically everything to Detective Ingram and his partner. Laverne wanted to break up with John but was terrified. To get rid of him, she devised a complicated and deadly strategy. She framed him for murder. Initially, she excelled. She read every newspaper item she could find to memorize Tanya's murder's facts. She discovered the missing denim swatch by sneaking a look at Ingram's list of evidence during her first apartment interview. Some was dumb luck. She predicted where the body was located on the highway, but she was right. Her strategy failed because she accidentally implicated herself in framing John. She believed that the police would sympathize with her and perceive her as a victim of John's deception, resulting in his arrest. But that didn't work. She was convicted of murder and imprisoned with him. Laverne and John were serving life sentences for a crime they didn't commit when the true perpetrator, the man who murdered Tanya Bennett, wrote to the authorities admitting. That was the letter the prosecutor called Ingram about. Laverne and John were released in 1995 after the true killer was arrested. Laverne's falsehoods got them 4 years in prison. 71-year-old Patrice Miller stood in front of her refrigerator in her little home one morning in early November 2023. She lived in rural Downeyville, California. Since she was running low on a few products, she ordered from the local market. They delivered her groceries, which was great. Patrice needed food delivery at this point. She lived alone and found housework harder as she aged. She was also having health issues, making movement difficult. Even with a walking stick, she navigated the house. Patrice heard one of her 2 cats meowing outside the door while she was making her grocery list. This prompted her to feed them. Thus, she delayed her list. She headed out the door with her walking stick after closing the fridge and pouring cat chow into a bowl. Patrice brought her porch cat food bowl. She had other outdoor tasks, but her walking stick limited her to 1. She returned inside to retrieve her kitchen compost bin after setting up her cat's feeding bowl. She returned to her garden. She finished these outdoor duties fast because she didn't like being outside anymore. She had lived in Downeyville for years, but it had become unsafe. Since she stayed to herself, she didn't realize how awful it was. She eventually heard from her neighbors that their properties were being invaded. Vandalism had increased, with yards messed up and residences broken into. After a few months, Patrice started experiencing it. After so many attempted break-ins at her house, she was convinced she had a stalker. She even installed metal bars on all her windows for security. Patrice disliked the outdoors because of that. She felt exposed and weak. She believed her stalker was following her and might attack her. She quickly dumped the compost in her garden, turned around and ran inside, locked the door. Once inside her residence, she breathed a great sigh of relief. A few days later, on November 8, Cassie Coe, a 55-year-old cashier, was counting up a client at Patrice's usual market. She bagged their stuff while thinking about something else. Patrice was on her mind. After years of delivering Patrice's groceries, Cassie had become more than a client and delivery lady. Friends? They frequently called to catch up. Cassie noticed she hadn't heard from Patrice in days. This was odd because of their closeness, and since Cassie knew Patrice hadn't ordered in a long. Cassie asked throughout the store, but no one had heard from Patrice. Cassie knew Patrice could be busy. Just about anyone else wouldn't worry about a missing order. Cassie was especially worried because she knew Patrice's stalker. She knew Patrice had phoned the police, but they weren't helpful. This tiny rural hamlet was inundated with these calls. Burglaries, harassment, vandalism. Nobody had reported actual violence yet. Thus, local officials were inundated with small complaints. Patrice's condition wasn't worse than anyone else's, but the sheriff's department weren't staffed to investigate them all. They only advised Patrice on house security, so she put window bars. Cassie knew Patrice was afraid of her stalker, whom she called Big Bastard. She worried about what he would do next. Cassie called Patrice again after her shift. Cassie phoned the police for a wellness check after failing to locate her. A Sierra County Sheriff's Department deputy parked in front of Patrice's house that evening after driving up the lengthy driveway. He knew something was wrong immediately. The house's front door was broken and hanging off its hinges. It seemed like a garden hose had been left on the porch stairs, pouring water everywhere. The deputy exited his cruiser and approached the residence. He turned off the water at the house's side spigot. Then, he climbed the porch's front stairs. He scanned the area for sounds as he moved. He had no notion if the house was still dangerous or what he was entering. He looked through a window before entering through the smashed front door to see what was going on. Blood was his first sight. Just inside the door, blood covered the floor. He unholstered his gun. The deputy entered the residence through the broken entryway with his revolver. He slowly walked across the living room, listening for movement or evidence of someone. But the house was quiet. No one was intruding, but Patrice was missing. The blood in front of the home was all he saw. The deputy went from living room to kitchen. After crossing the threshold, he paused. The room was completely disorganized. All cabinet doors were open. The floor was covered in food, packing, and broken glass jars. The kitchen's far-end window was destroyed, and Patrice's security bars were bent and twisted, dangling on their hinges. The deputy initially missed what was on the floor in the center of the kitchen due to the clutter and devastation. Once his brain digested the sight, he understood he was gazing at Patrice. What was left of her, she no longer appeared human. Her body was mangled. The deputy fled the residence and reported his horrible discovery. Patrice's property was filled with police, crime scene technicians, and forensic experts within an hour. Detectives spoke to Patrice's neighbors as they spread out. The authorities quickly profiled Patrice's killer because practically everyone in the neighborhood had been experiencing the identical break-ins and property damage. The killer was the same person pestering everyone else, they concluded. The police couldn't figure out why. Why did Patrice face such serious violence while everyone else simply experienced minor vandalism? Police were reconstructing Patrice's last day's movements while searching for her killer. At first, they were stuck. It appeared she had only done basic duties that day. They discovered two minor details that explained everything as they investigated those chores. Patrice has been making two bad blunders every day for 2 years. She fed her cats on the porch and dumped her compost in the garden. Big Bastard, her stalker, came to her home because of these two innocent activities. A black bear named Big Bastard. His favorite foods were cat food and kitchen garbage. He eventually considered Patrice food. The bear waited as Patrice fed her pets and emptied her compost for the last time in early November 2023. After waiting until Patrice was asleep, it broke into her house and brutally killed her. The deputy arrived at her home after days of the bear returning and eating Patrice's remains. Black bears rarely attack. Patrice was California's first black bear fatality. The disaster was caused by such absence of perceived risk. Because of this, officials didn't help Patrice or her neighbors with bare complaints. They wondered, what could go wrong? Many thanks for viewing. Comment your thoughts about today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time. See you. Sometimes the world presents us with a story so strange, so perfectly bizarre, that it feels like it must have a supernatural explanation. A voice from beyond the grave, a town-wide curse, a ghost reaching through a wall. These are the kinds of tales that make the hair on your arms stand up. But often, when you peel back the layers of the impossible, you don't find a ghost. You find something far more terrifying. A human being. Today we have 3 stories that all start in that strange, mysterious place, but end with a truth that is all too real and all too dark. Late on the night of the 26th of October 1968, a 72-year-old woman named Ethel Harris was resting in her living room in Toledo, Ohio. The house was quiet, and she was just enjoying the peace before heading to bed. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sharp ring of the telephone. The first thing Ethel did was glance at the clock on the mantelpiece. The hands pointed to 10:30. That was unusual. Very few people, if any, ever called her this late at night. A knot of worry tightened in her stomach. A call at this hour usually meant bad news. She slowly got to her feet, walked over to the phone, and picked up the receiver. She said, "Hello?" On the other end of the line, a man's voice said back, "Hey sis." Ethel instantly recognized the voice. It wasn't one of her brothers, despite the familiar greeting. It was someone who was practically family, her husband Don's very best friend, a 59-year-old man named Lee Epps. For decades, Lee had been their next-door neighbor. He and Don and Ethel were inseparable. They were at each other's houses almost every single day, sharing meals, helping with chores, just living life together. They were the kind of friends who become an extension of your own family. A few years back, Lee had moved to a different town, so they didn't see each other quite as often, but the bond was still just as strong. They still got together whenever they could, and Lee made a point to call regularly just to check in and see how they were doing. So, hearing Lee's voice wasn't a surprise. But the time of the call was still a bit odd. Ethel figured he was just calling for a late-night chat. But before she could even reply to his greeting, before she could ask why he was calling so late, Lee just kept talking. It was strange. It was like he wasn't having a conversation with her, but was just delivering a message he had to get out. He spoke in a flat, hurried tone. He said, "Hey sis, I'm feeling really bad. Like I've never felt this way before. I really need your husband, Don, to get in touch with me the moment he gets back." And then, just like that, the line went dead. He had hung up. Ethel stood there, holding the silent receiver, completely bewildered. The whole call had lasted maybe 10 seconds. On one hand, it seemed like he was just checking in, but the words he used were serious, alarming. "I've never felt this way before. That's not something you say lightly." But there was something else, something that made a chill run down her spine. How did Lee know that Dawn wasn't home? Her husband was out for the evening and wasn't due back for a little while. Lee had stated it as a fact, the moment he gets back. It was as if he was standing outside their window watching the house. But that was impossible. He lived in another town. It just didn't make any sense. Feeling a growing sense of unease, Ethel tried to call him back immediately. The phone just rang and rang. No answer? She tried again a few minutes later, and then again. Still nothing. By the time her husband, Don, finally walked through the front door a little while later, Ethel was pacing with worry. She immediately told him about the strange call from Lee. She recounted the conversation word for word. She told him, "He said he wasn't feeling good, that he needed you to call him as soon as you got back." "But Don, the weirdest part was how he knew you were out." Don was just as confused as she was. He said, "All right, that's weird." He took the phone from Ethel and dialed Lee's number himself. Again, it just rang unanswered. Now, Don was getting seriously concerned. He turned to Ethel and said, go over it again. What was his tone like? Did he sound like he was in pain? Was he scared? What exactly did he say? Ethel tried her best to describe it. She said, I don't know, he just sounded distant. He just stated that he didn't feel good and had never felt this way before. And he was very specific that you needed to call him when you came back. I just don't understand it. They both stood there in the quiet house, a shared feeling of dread hanging in the air. They knew Lee well enough to know he wasn't one for drama. If he said something was wrong, then something was wrong. After a few more failed attempts to reach him, they decided they couldn't just sit there and wait. They had to do something. They decided to just drive to his house in the next town and check on him in person just to make sure he was okay. So they locked up their house, got in their car, and started the drive into the dark night. When they finally arrived at Lee's house, all the lights were off. The place was dark and still. His car wasn't in the driveway. A quick look through the windows confirmed he wasn't there. Now, their worry was turning into real fear. Even though it was late, they started knocking on the doors of his neighbors, hoping someone had seen him or knew where he might be. After a few doors with no luck, one neighbor finally gave them a piece of information. The neighbor said they had seen an ambulance at Lee's house earlier in the evening and believed he had been taken to the hospital. For Ethel and Dawn, this was confirmation of their worst fears. Something was seriously wrong with their friend. They thanked the neighbor and rushed back to their car, heading straight for the nearest hospital, a place called Mercy Hospital. When they arrived, they hurried into the emergency room and spoke to the front desk. They explained that they were looking for their friend, Lee Epps. The nurse checked her records and confirmed that yes, Lee had been admitted earlier that night. But then her expression shifted, and her voice softened. She told them that, unfortunately, Lee had passed away. The news was a devastating blow. They had been friends for most of their lives. The thought of him being gone so suddenly and unexpectedly was almost impossible to process. But the most shocking part of their discovery was yet to come. As they spoke with the medical staff trying to understand what had happened to him, Dawn asked a simple question. He asked what time Lee had passed away. A doctor looked at the chart and then looked back at them. He told Ethel and Dawn that after some complications, Lee ultimately passed away at precisely 10:30 that night. The exact moment, the exact minute. His official time of death was the very same moment that the phone had rung in Ethel's living room. The same moment she had heard her friend's voice on the other end of the line, saying he had never felt this way before and that he needed to speak to his best friend one last time. Ethel and Dawn had no way to prove it, of course. It was just their word against the laws of physics. But for the rest of their lives, they firmly believed that the phone call they received that night wasn't from a telephone line. It was from somewhere else. It was Lee's spirit reaching across the veil to say goodbye. But a mysterious phone call is one thing. What was happening in a small village in rural China was something else entirely. It was a tragedy on a scale that was almost unimaginable. One afternoon in the summer of 2006, a 70-year-old man named Ma King Mao and several of his family members walked through the streets of their home, Luowan village. Luowan was, or at least it had been, a beautiful and historic place. As they walked, they passed lush green fields and could see majestic mountains rising in the distance. But the scenery was scarred. Interspersed with the beauty were the charred, skeletal remains of dozens of buildings. It was a constant, painful reminder of what their community had lost. Ma King Mao had lived in this village his entire life. He remembered a time when it was a happy, vibrant, tight-knit community of over 100 people. It was a truly picturesque place to live, a place where everyone knew each other and looked out for one another. But 3 years prior, everything had changed. Life in Luowan village had become a living nightmare, one disaster piling on top of another. It started with the fires. There hadn't been just one, but 2 enormous fires that had ripped through the village. The official cause was faulty wiring. These fires had destroyed homes, businesses, and priceless historic buildings. They had fundamentally changed the face of the town and years later, the scars still hadn't healed. But as devastating as the fires were, it was what happened after the embers cooled that truly turned the village into a place of fear. For some unexplainable reason, the mortality rate in their small village suddenly skyrocketed. It seemed like every week someone else was just dropping dead. Healthy people, young people, it didn't matter. They would get sick suddenly and then pass away. The villagers became terrified. They started to believe that some kind of invisible plague had descended upon them, a curse they couldn't see or understand. The situation got so bad, with so many people dying, that China's Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, sent a team to conduct a full-blown investigation. They spent weeks in the village, testing, interviewing, and analyzing, but their conclusion was baffling. They announced that there was no connection between the deaths. They determined that everyone who had died had passed away from common illnesses or old age. They were all, according to the experts, natural deaths. It was just a tragic, statistical anomaly, an unfortunate spike in the mortality rate that just happened to follow the horrible fires. It was, they said, just a string of terrible coincidences. But many of the villagers, including Ma Qingmao, simply didn't buy it. It felt wrong. It felt like something more was at play. They started to whisper that their village wasn't unlucky. It was cursed. And so, on this summer afternoon, Ma Qingmao and his family walked past the burned-out shells of their old lives, making their way to the village temple. They were there for yet another funeral. This time, it was for a young woman from the village who had died just as inexplicably as all the others. According to the CDC, her death was from natural causes. But to the people who knew her, it made no sense at all. They filed into the temple, another cloud of grief hanging over their cursed home. Later that same night, Ma Qingmao stumbled through the dark, quiet streets, heading back to his house. After the funeral, he and his family had gone to the deceased woman's family home for a ceremonial dinner, which was a local custom. His family had left right after the meal, but Ma Qingmao, feeling particularly down about the state of his village, had stayed behind. He continued to eat and drink some alcohol, sharing stories and sorrows with his neighbors. Now, he was finally making his way home. But as he walked, a sudden, sharp pain shot through his stomach. It was so intense it nearly buckled his knees, making it incredibly difficult to walk. He clutched his abdomen, forcing himself to put one foot in front of the other, his house seeming miles away. When he finally reached his front door, he fumbled with the latch and stumbled inside. The pain was so blinding, so all-consuming, that he could only scream out for help before collapsing onto the floor right in front of his horrified family. As he lay on the ground, he began to vomit uncontrollably. And then, just moments later, he passed away. His family could do nothing but watch in horror. Now, Ma Qingmao wasn't a village leader or a person of great influence. He was just a man who had lived there his whole life, a man everyone knew and respected. But for some reason, his death felt different. It felt monumental. For the people of Luan village, it was the absolute final straw. When they heard the news, a collective feeling washed over the community. Enough is enough. There was no possible way that all these deaths were natural. They refused to accept that answer any longer. The village director, who was essentially the town's mayor, got on the phone with the provincial health department. He explained the entire situation, the fires, the string of deaths, the CDC's inconclusive findings, and the village's refusal to believe them. The health department agreed to look into it and sent a team of 20 experts to the village. They conducted another massive investigation, trying to find any link, anything that could explain what was happening. And after all their work, they came back with the exact same conclusion as the CDC. It was all natural. There was nothing to worry about. But the villagers were not worrying. They were terrified and angry. They went back to their director and demanded that he do something else. This was not an acceptable answer. And he agreed. He made one last call, this time to the local police. He asked them to come in and conduct their own investigation, to look at this not as a health crisis, but as a potential crime. He begged them to see if there was anything, any small detail that the scientists might have missed. And so, the police came to Luoan village. They didn't bring microscopes or testing kits. They brought a different perspective. They started a broad, sweeping investigation, and very quickly they found something. Something the health experts had completely overlooked. And what they discovered explained everything. It turned out the village had one doctor, a man named Ma Fuxing. But Ma was not a real doctor. His medical training consisted of reading a couple of medical books. That was it. He had no formal education, no license, no real idea of what he was doing. And yet, he was the only person the villagers could turn to when they had any medical issues. He directly benefited every time someone got sick because they would come to him and pay for his useless treatments. So you had a man, posing as a doctor, who likely made his patients even sicker, and he was profiting from their illness. That was bad enough. But it got so much worse. Ma Fuxing was also the owner of the village's only funeral home. So, if his fake medicine didn't work and you died, he profited from you again. Ma Fuxing had a complete monopoly on sickness and death in Luoan village. If you got sick, he made money. If you died, he made money. The only way he didn't make money was if you stayed healthy. For a while, Ma Fuxing was content to just let this system play out. He was a fake doctor and a funeral director, and business was steady enough. But eventually, he got greedy. He wanted more money. So he started secretly poisoning the village's water supply with cyanide. Suddenly, more people started getting sick. And more people started dying. And for every single one of them, Ma Fuxing collected a fee. But even that wasn't enough. He wanted more. And so he looked around the village and decided to create even more death and suffering. Those two massive fires, the ones that were officially ruled as being caused by faulty wiring, that wasn't faulty wiring. That was arson. Ma Fuxing had set the fires himself, burning people's homes and businesses to the ground, killing people in the process, all because he knew he had a monopoly on the aftermath. Every death was just more business for him. The police investigation unraveled his entire scheme. They re-examined the fire scenes and quickly determined it was arson. From there, they started asking the one question the health experts never did: who benefits? All roads led back to Ma Fuxing. In the end, they determined he was responsible for the deaths of 76 people. These were his neighbors, people he had known his entire life. His friends. He had systematically murdered 76 of them for profit. He was ultimately arrested, convicted of murder and arson, and sentenced to death. The curse on Luoan village wasn't supernatural. It was a man. It's hard to imagine a more evil person. But sometimes evil isn't a stranger poisoning a town from the shadows. Sometimes it's sleeping in the room right next to yours. One morning in September of 1893, a 25-year-old man named Paul Marsh was sitting at a large dining room table inside his aunt's house in New Haven, Connecticut. He was there with his mother and his father for a family visit. They were staying with his aunt, a woman named Miss Blackwood, and also visiting with his 19-year-old cousin, a young woman named Malene. Malene was Miss Blackwood's ward. Her own parents had died 4 years earlier, leaving her an orphan, and the very wealthy Miss Blackwood had graciously taken her in. She had become Malene's de facto mother. On this particular morning, Paul, his parents, and Malene were all gathered for a luxurious breakfast that Miss Blackwood's housemaid had prepared. They were chatting and enjoying the food, but they were all waiting for one person to join them, Miss Blackwood herself. And this wasn't just a formality out of respect for their host. They genuinely adored her. Paul's aunt was a wonderful woman, full of energy and life. She was fun, she was witty, and yes, she was very wealthy, and her house was magnificent. Family visits with Miss Blackwood were always something to look forward to. Her arrival downstairs was what would truly start the day. But as time stretched on, and Miss Blackwood still hadn't appeared, the family began to eat. They figured she was just sleeping in or taking her time getting ready, and they would see her soon enough. So they ate their food and made pleasant conversation, enjoying the nice morning. Suddenly, their peaceful breakfast was shattered. The housemaid, who had gone upstairs a few minutes earlier, came running back into the dining room. Her face was pale with panic, and she was clearly distraught. She cried out that Miss Blackwood was dead. For a moment, Paul was just completely confused. It didn't make any sense. Just the night before, his aunt had been her usual vibrant self. She had seemed perfectly normal, perfectly healthy. There was absolutely no sign that anything was wrong with her. But the family immediately rushed out of the dining room and followed the frantic housemaid up the grand staircase to Miss Blackwood's bedroom. They pushed open the door, and there she was. Paul's aunt was lying in her bed, still and silent. She was cold to the touch. She was gone. Later that morning, Paul and his heartbroken family sat in the living room with Miss Blackwood's regular family doctor. He had just come from examining her body upstairs. He sat down with them and explained that while there were no clear signs of illness or injury, Miss Blackwood was 70 years old and had been diagnosed with heart disease a few years prior. In his professional opinion, her heart had simply given out in her sleep. It was a peaceful end. For the most part, the family reacted with a mixture of profound sadness and reluctant acceptance. It was tragic, but it made sense. Paul felt the same way, logically. It was awful, he couldn't believe she was gone, but the doctor's explanation seemed plausible. And yet, underneath the logic, there was a strange, nagging feeling that he couldn't shake. Something felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, he couldn't articulate why, but he had an immediate gut-wrenching sense that this was not the whole story. He felt that something else had happened to his aunt. But Paul didn't say anything. He kept his suspicions to himself. It felt inappropriate to start suggesting conspiracy theories just hours after his aunt had died, especially when there was a perfectly logical explanation right in front of them. So, he stayed quiet, but the feeling didn't go away. It just sat there in the pit of his stomach. After the doctor left, Paul and his family decided that they would all stay at Miss Blackwood's house for the time being. There was so much to do. They had a funeral to plan, and they had to begin the complicated process of dealing with her will and her large estate. Since they had already planned to be there for a visit anyway, they decided to stay and help manage everything during this difficult transition. 5 weeks passed. Paul and his family were still living in Miss Blackwood's house. Sorting out her estate was proving to be a massive and complicated task, and it was taking much longer than anyone had anticipated. By this point, Paul's role in the legal and financial matters was minimal. He was mostly just there to provide emotional support for his parents as they navigated the complex paperwork. But secretly, Paul had taken on a mission of his own. He still hadn't told anyone about his persistent feeling that his aunt had been killed. He knew how crazy it sounded, especially since he had absolutely no evidence to support it other than that powerful gut feeling. But he hadn't been able to let it go. He had started his own quiet, secret investigation. His investigation had led him to a strange decision. He had started sleeping in his late aunt's bedroom. He had developed a belief that if he slept in her bed, in her room, then maybe her ghost would visit him. Maybe she would give him a sign, a clue, some kind of message that would tell him what really happened to her. For weeks, he had slept there every night, waiting. But he had seen nothing. No ghosts, no signs. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. On this particular night, 5 weeks to the day after his aunt's death, Paul was lying in her bed, getting ready to fall asleep. As he lay there in the darkness, he heard a strange sound coming from the side of the room. It was a faint, scraping noise, almost like scratching. The room was very dark, with only a little bit of moonlight filtering through the window. He opened his eyes and rolled over, peering into the shadows in the direction of the sound. At first, he couldn't see anything. But, as his eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a hand. A disembodied hand connected to an arm was reaching out from the wall, stretching into the room in his direction. Now, Paul had obviously never seen anything like this before. Logically, he should have been terrified. He was, for all intents and purposes, seeing a ghost. But he wasn't scared. A strange sense of calm and validation washed over him. He thought, this is it. It's working. My aunt is here. She's going to tell me what happened. This was the sign he had been waiting for. With absolutely no fear, Paul got out of the bed. He walked silently across the room towards the disembodied arm that was protruding from the wall. And then he reached out and grabbed it. The moment his hand closed around the arm, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the house. It wasn't a ghostly wail, it was the very real shriek of a terrified person. The sound woke everyone up. Paul's father came running down the hall and burst into the bedroom. The sight that greeted him was baffling. He saw his son, Paul, standing in the middle of the room, holding onto an arm that was sticking out of a hole in the wall. It turned out there really was an arm reaching through the wall, but it wasn't a ghost. It belonged to a person who had everything to do with Miss Blackwood's death, because she did not die of heart disease. She was murdered. The person sleeping in the room next door had drilled a hole through the wall, a hole just big enough for an arm to pass through. And late at night, while Miss Blackwood was asleep, that person had reached through the hole and poured poison into the glass of water she always kept by her bedside. She had died in her sleep from the poison, and it had been mistaken for a heart attack. The killer was aware that Paul was suspicious. Even though Paul had kept his thoughts to himself, his actions, especially his insistence on sleeping in Miss Blackwood's room, had made the killer very nervous. It seemed like Paul was getting close to the truth. And so, the killer decided to get rid of him the same way they had gotten rid of his aunt. They waited for Paul to be asleep, saw the glass of water next to his bed, and reached through the hole to pour poison into it. But they hadn't counted on Paul being awake, waiting for a ghost. He heard the sound, saw the arm, and grabbed it, thinking he was making contact with the spirit world. In reality, he was catching his own would-be killer in the act. The screams were the sound of the killer, realizing they had been caught. And the killer was Paul's own 19-year-old cousin, Malene. After her parents died, Miss Blackwood had taken Malene in and treated her like her own daughter. She had even added Malene to her will, ensuring the girl would inherit a significant portion of her vast fortune. But Malene couldn't wait for her aunt to die of natural causes. She wanted the money now. And so she had murdered the woman who had saved her. Caught red-handed, Malene quickly confessed everything to Paul and his parents. They sent for the police to come and arrest her for the murder of Miss Blackwood and the attempted murder of Paul. But before the police could arrive, Malene suddenly began bleeding from her mouth. She collapsed onto the floor and died just minutes later. While it was never officially confirmed, it's widely believed that she used the very same poison she had used on her aunt to take her own life, choosing to die rather than face justice for her crimes. Every story tonight started with something that seemed supernatural. But in the end, the real horror wasn't a curse or a ghost. It was human greed. Because sometimes the darkest thing in this world isn't what hides in the shadows. It's what people are willing to do for money, power, or just a little bit more. Until next time. Kenika Jenkins, who was 19 years old at the time, was getting ready to make plans to go out with her friends on the evening of Friday, the 8th of September, 2017. She was going to go out with her pals. It was the kind of night that seemed to be full with potential that had not yet been realized. The kind of night that many of us remember from when we were that age. An invitation to a birthday party had been made to Kenika and her 3 friends, and it was not any ordinary party of any type. Kenika and her friends have been invited to attend. The Crowne Plaza Chicago O'Hare Hotel, which had an aura of refinement and a touch of glitz, was the location of the event that was being conducted. They were all overjoyed and happy. To get to the hotel, which was located in the neighborhood of Rosemont and was in close proximity to the airport, they got into their vehicle and drove there. The hotel was located in Rosemont. While they were driving, they were laughing and talking about the night that was going to come, and the lights of Chicago offered a backdrop that was familiar to them. Around 11 o'clock on that particular evening, they arrived at the parking lot of the hotel where they were staying. As soon as they discovered a parking spot, they got out of the van and made their way into the lobby of the Crown Plaza, which was a well-lit area. If we were to claim that the atmosphere was typical of a hotel that was filled on a Friday night, we would be understating the situation. In addition to checking in and going to the bar, there was a steady stream of individuals coming and going during the whole day. The group of friends that Kanika was with made their way to the elevator and then proceeded to rise to the 9th floor before arriving at their destination. Room 926 was the location where the event was held. As soon as they opened the door to the room where they were staying, the celebration had already begun in full swing. There were a significant number of people, including friends and friends of friends, who were jammed into the small hotel room despite its limited space. At the same time that people were dancing and the music was playing at a loud volume, beverages were freely passed from one person to another. As they had anticipated, the setting was brimming with life and vitality, which was exactly what they had brought with them. Kanika and her friends joined in very quickly when the news broke. There was a whirlwind of music, laughter, and conversation, and the hours began to blend together and became less distinct as the conversation continued. When Kanika arrived at the party, she was drinking much like a large number of other individuals who were there. As the night went, it became increasingly apparent to a few of the other individuals who were attending the party that she was becoming quite intoxicated. This was the case since she was getting more and more drunk. At one point, when they attempted to give Kanika a hug, they discovered that she was so unsteady on her feet that she was unable to stand up on her own. Later on, a witness who was present at the moment provided this information to the detectives who were conducting the investigation. Another witness recalled seeing Kanika after some time had passed, and they both recalled seeing her. While the most of the people were standing up and dancing around in reaction to the music, Kanika was sitting on the edge of the bed, which was situated off to the side. Kanika was taking a seat on the edge of the bed. It appeared as though she lacked the stamina and coordination required to even stand up, let alone dance, based on the manner in which she held herself. The mere act of sitting there gave the impression that she was unable to deal with the quantity of alcohol that she had ingested. It has been a couple of hours since that earlier time. It was sometime about 3 o'clock in the morning when the event took place. The celebration was beginning to wind down when Kanika and the 3 friends that she had brought with her to the party came to the conclusion that it was time to call it a night and head back home, despite the fact that they had been celebrating for quite some time. After saying their goodbyes to one another, the 2 of them made their way through the bustling area and then exited onto the corridor on the 9th level, which was quite calm on that level. As the 4 of them made their way down the lengthy corridor in the direction of the elevators, the hotel's security cameras would eventually record them as they made their way down the corridor. After a long night out, they gave the impression of being any other group of young people that they could have been of any other age. All the way down to the ground floor where they exited the elevator, they were transported by the elevator, which brought them all the way down. Following their departure from the building, they entered the main lobby, which had grown noticeably less boisterous in comparison to the time when they had initially arrived. Just as they were beginning to make their way towards the main door, Kanika suddenly came to a complete and utter halt. She had the intention of heading out to the parking lot and locating their vehicle. At first, she was checking her pockets, and then she checked her handbag. She was getting ready to leave. When she gazed at her face, she gave off the impression of being confused. Nevertheless, she was devoid of the keys to her vehicle. In addition to that, she was unable to place her cell phone anywhere in the vicinity. She took the time to explain to her pals that she must have overlooked the people who were still present in the establishment. They were able to establish control of the situation, despite the fact that Kanika was substantially more intoxicated than her friends were at the time. When they shifted their attention to Kanika, it was clear that she was having trouble standing and keeping her head in an upright position. They told her to come to a stop and wait in this location. Ensure that you continue to be present in this very lobby. We will have to return to room 926 inches order to find your stuff for you. We apologize for the inconvenience. At first glance, it seemed like a basic approach. The moment Kanika gave a little nod, her companions turned around and headed back in the direction of the elevators, leaving her to be by herself in the lobby. The group of her friends returned to the party room, which was situated on the second story of the building. First, they spent a few minutes searching the disorganized room for her pocketbook, and then they finally found it. On the other hand, they were not successful in their exploration. Both her cell phone and one of her keys were discovered inside the house. It was clear that they had been successful in achieving their goals. After leaving the party for the second time, they ultimately made their way back down to the lobby in order to meet up with Kanika. They did this with a sense of relief before leaving the party. Nevertheless, there were no people present in the foyer upon the opening of the elevator doors and their departure from the elevator, because he was no longer present. They looked around, considering the likelihood that she had most likely just gone outside to get some fresh air. They were thinking about this possibility. Upon exiting the primary door, they proceeded to explore the surrounding region and take in their surroundings. It is not true, she was not there. Currently, it seemed as though they were not really concerned about the situation. After some consideration, they arrived at the conclusion that she must have become exhausted from waiting, and as a result, she ultimately chose to walk out to the car by herself. The three of them began going through the parking lot till they found their vehicle. This was done in order to locate their automobile. Nevertheless, Kanika was not there when they got at the area where they were waiting. In addition to the fact that she was not inside the vehicle, she was also not standing in any geographical vicinity to it. Suddenly, a glimmer of worry started to creep into my consciousness. I was concerned about something. The fact that their buddy was incredibly intoxicated, in addition to the fact that it was the middle of the night, left them completely confused about where she was. In addition, they were in possession of her phone, which meant that they were unable to even call her in order to inquire about her location. Teresa Martin, Kanika's mother, should be approached as the next logical step, according to the conclusion that they reached via their investigation. After taking out their phone, one of the pals called the number that had been provided to them from the list of available numbers. When Teresa picked up the phone in the middle of the night, she was immediately overtaken with a feeling of dread. This feeling occurred very quickly. As a result of the physical distance that separated them, the voice of the friend of her daughter who was on the other end of the line sounded peculiar. The events that had taken place were described in detail by them. They informed her that they had just left the party that was held at the Crown Plaza after they had left the party. Because Kanika was unable to find either her phone or her keys, they had left her in the lobby so that she could go look for them. This was done so that she could go and find them. After returning to the ground, they were unable to locate her anywhere in the area. Teresa was given the assurance that they had her phone and keys and that everything was probably fine, but they were unable to locate Kanika. Teresa was offered this assurance. Teresa's thoughts seemed to be racing at a quick pace. It was a straightforward inquiry that she addressed to them. Were any of you drinking any alcohol? A little lull occurred in the conversation that was taking place on the other end of the line. Both of the friends gave off the impression of being anxious and guarded. The situation was minimized by them, and they replied something along the lines of, "Oh no, maybe a drink or two." They continued to go on and on about how certain they were that Kanika was doing well for herself. However, when it came to Teresa, her instincts as a mother were screaming that something was horribly, extremely wrong. She was concerned about her daughter. Despite the fact that it was 3:30 in the morning, her daughter had not been seen for a considerable amount of time, and her friends were completely unaware of her disappearance. The fact that she would be arriving to the hotel on her own was something that she shared with them. At some point in the future, she was going to recover her children. Teresa Martin came at the Crown Plaza Hotel at a time that was quite close to 5 o'clock in the morning. The sun had not yet risen at that precise instant in time. She entered the tranquil lobby with the idea of locating Kanika, and she did it with a single, unwavering goal in mind. The first thing that she did was to go right to the front desk, and this was the first thing that she did. An explanation of the issue was provided by her to the manager who was on duty at the time. She shared with him the news that her daughter, Kanika Jenkins, had been present at a party that was situated on the 9th degree. It was stated by her that her companions had discovered her in this very same lobby the last time they saw her, but that she had disappeared since that time. Although Teresa made an effort to keep her calm, it is clear that she is in a desperate state of mind because of the tone of her voice. However, despite the fact that I am certain that she is doing well, we are unable to find her. Due to the fact that her friends have access to her phone, I am unable to get in touch with her. Would it be feasible for you to take a brief look at the footage that was captured by your security cameras in order to figure out where she went? We are unable to determine if she has left the hotel, or whether she is still present somewhere within the establishment, or whether she has departed the hotel. Viewing the video footage is all that is required of us at this time. It appeared as though the request, which was made by a mother who was experiencing fear, was reasonable. The personnel at the hotel, on the other hand, was completely and utterly unyielding in their refusal. She was advised by the management that they were unable to share her with the footage that was captured by the protection system. His point was that it was against the policy of the hotel to show a film to a guest who had not yet filed an official report with the police regarding a missing person. He believed that this was a violation of the hotel's policy. In spite of the fact that this is a widely accepted rationale, it is not necessarily legally required in the majority of situations. It is possible for a hotel to collaborate with other establishments in the event of an emergency situation in order to provide assistance in the search for a person who may be in danger. But this management was inflexible in their approach. No support was offered by him in any way. It was explained to Teresa by him that in order for her to watch the movie, she would first have to go and file a complaint for a missing person. Teresa was taken aback by the news. She was feeling more and more afraid with each passing minute, and she was becoming increasingly agitated. At the same time that time was running out, those individuals who were in a position to provide assistance to her continued to maintain their obstinate unwillingness to do so. Teresa, who was under the notion that she had no other choice, left the lobby of the hotel and stood outside in the chilly early morning hours. She was under the impression that she had no other options. After removing her own phone from her pocket, she dialed the number for the police department. In addition, she offered an additional explanation on the entire incident. In spite of the fact that the hotel had surveillance footage that could reveal the location of her child's whereabouts, they refused to show it to her without first receiving a complaint from the authorities. A search for her daughter was conducted at the motel. She repeatedly pleaded with the dispatcher to send an officer to this location in order to persuade them to show us the movie. Despite the fact that the officers were eager to listen to her, it seemed as though they did not share her sense of urgency over the matter. She requested, "Can you please send an officer down here?" When viewed from their perspective, it seemed as though this was a situation that occurred rather regularly. A young person who was 19 years old was present at the party that was being held. Overindulging in alcohol was her habit. She left on her own accord. Every single time it happens to be the case. Teresa was advised that her daughter was most likely with other friends and that it was possible that she had returned to a separate room in the hotel in order to get some rest. Teresa was also informed that it was possible that her daughter took a nap. They advised her to exercise patience and wait for a couple of hours before making any decisions. Be sure to check and see if Kanika is present. It is possible that she will call them once again in the event that she has not yet arrived by that time. Teresa was now feeling a double dosage of frustration as a result of the situation. In the beginning, there was the hotel, and now there are the police. Nobody took her seriously. She was not being taken seriously. At first glance, it seemed as though no one could possibly comprehend the terror that she was going through. During the time that the sun was just about to rise, her daughter had been absent for a substantial amount of time. She came to the conclusion that she would go out and look for Kanika on her own in the case that no one else was ready to help her search for her. In no way was she going to do nothing but wait around. There was no way that she would do that. At the same time as she was making her way back into the hotel, her determination got greater. Following her ascent into an elevator, she made her way to the 9th floor, which was the location of the party that had been hosted earlier. Initially, she started pounding on doors at one end of the hallway, and then she worked her way to the opposite end of the hallway. From door to door, she knocked on each and every one of them. She went door to door. In the event that she received a response, she would question as to whether or not the individual had seen her daughter Kendall. She would query as to whether or not she was there in their chamber by describing her through the use of her description. There was a significant amount of time that she spent walking around the floors of that hotel. As she made her way from the 9th level to the 8th floor, and then from the 8th floor to the 7th floor, she not only questioned every person she saw, but also knocked on every door she encountered. She was a single mother who was on a mission. She was frantic and frightened about the situation. Despite this, she was not making any headway at all. It was impossible to find Kanika anywhere. This continued to take place all throughout the morning and into the afternoon, even after it had already begun. After Kanika had been seen for the remaining time, the administration of the hotel eventually found out where Teresa was located at roughly 1:15 inches the afternoon. This was nearly 10 hours after Kanika had been seen for the last time. They came to the realization that she was actively searching for her daughter by going from one residence to another in an effort to find her. In addition, rather than offering to help her, they went ahead and reported her to the authorities. They not only filed a report of trespassing against her, but they also issued an order that she be removed from the residential property. In light of this, law enforcement officers arrived at the Crown Plaza for the second time on that particular day. Nevertheless, they were present this time in order to deal with Teresa during this particular instance. As soon as she encountered the law enforcement officers, she was presented with a fresh opportunity. It was with great urgency that she approached them and pleaded with them to reconsider their decision. "My daughter has not been seen or heard from since 10 hours ago. I have not been able to locate her. I myself am in possession of it. We are currently in possession of her keys. My attempts to get in touch with her have been unsuccessful. It would be really appreciated if you could request that the hotel give you a copy of the surveillance film." After being approached by a mother who was obviously not going to give up, the police officers complied with the request this time around. Teresa accompanied the officers as they made their way to the front desk, where they gave the manager the information that they needed access to the CCTV film. After receiving their request, the staff at the hotel showed them the footage that they had requested. On the other hand, the only cameras that were shown to them were those that were situated in close proximity to the principal entrances of the hotel. The film was evaluated by both the law enforcement officers and the security personnel working at the hotel. It was during the late hours of the previous night that they were able to see Kanika making her way into the hotel with her friends. In spite of this, they never once saw her leave the area when they were going over the hours of tape. According to the information that we have, it does not appear that Kanika has left through any of the principal entrances. It seemed as though this was abundantly plenty for both the law enforcement and the motel establishment. After that, they switched their focus to Teresa and were on the verge of saying, well, there you have it. She is still present in a particular area of the hotel. They were under the impression that their task was complete. After seeing the movie that was shown to them, they were able to formulate a straightforward response to the question. There is no attempt made to seek information regarding the existence of additional cameras. Could you please confirm whether or not there is surveillance equipment installed in the basement, the service areas, and the corridors? The investigation had been completed at this point in time due to its conclusion. Following that, they conveyed to Teresa the news that they were no longer able to contribute to her assistance. Furthermore, due to the fact that the hotel had filed a complaint, she was no longer allowed to remain on the grounds with the goal of conducting a search. She was left with no other option but to leave, and the result was that her heart was broken in the process. Her hunt for answers was fruitless, and at this time she was unable to even look for her child on her own. She was at a loss for explanations. Teresa and her family were unable to see through the haze that was the remaining hours of the day, and they were filled with the most terrible suffering. It was impossible for them to assist. It was quite difficult for them to find Kanika within that hotel, despite the fact that she was most certainly located somewhere within the establishment. The initial idea that she had simply drifted out with friends or gone to another room grew less and less plausible with each passing hour. This was because she had been out for a longer period of time. Due to the fact that she had been absent for a considerable amount of time, this was the result. Both her phone and her keys were out of her possession. Her lack of communication with anyone was a problem. Despite the fact that her mother had spent a number of hours doing a comprehensive search of the public floors of the hotel, she had not been successful in locating her daughter. The passage of time itself was the one little detail that destroyed the idea, and it was the one thing that utterly demolished the core drunk teenager will turn up theory. Extremely long periods of time had already elapsed. Something was wrong with the circumstance. A nagging feeling that had started in the middle of the night had now turned into a full-blown certainty for her family that Kanika was in extremely precarious circumstances. This realization came about as a result of all that had happened. Late that night, after what seemed like an eternity, someone or something shifted. 10 o'clock is the hour of the night. The Rosemont Police Department made the decision to go to the hotel and review the security footage once more on Saturday, 17 hours after Kanika had vanished without a trace. When they examined the material this time, they did it with a greater degree of caution. A number of factors may have contributed to this decision, including the realization that this was not a typical incident of a missing individual or the pressure that was exerted by the family. In this particular instance, they did not only look at the cameras that were covering the exits, they also looked at other cameras. They started looking through film from a number of different areas within the hotel where Kanika was staying in an effort to piece together a timeline of the activities that Kanika was known to have participated in before moving on. That was the period when they were successful in locating her. Through the use of a webcam feed that was recorded in the early hours of the morning, they were able to observe Kanika. The timestamp on the video indicated that it was 3:20 inches the morning immediately after her friends had left her in the lobby. This occurred just a short while after they had abandoned her. While Kanika was wandering about the motel, it was clear from the footage that she was completely by herself. There is little doubt that she was experiencing a severe case of disorientation. After exiting the main lobby area, she went in the direction of a staircase that led down rather than moving towards the exit or back to the guest elevators. She ultimately chose to take the stairway. The stairway was followed by her until she reached the bottom of the stairs. After making her way down the steps, she found herself in a part of the hotel that was not designed for use by guests. She might be found in a service corridor that was situated on the basement level of the main building. It was observed that she was walking along a lengthy corridor that was completely devoid of any individuals at any point over the course of the video. It was impossible for her to stand for an extended period of time. While she was lurching forward, she was making an effort to stabilize herself by crashing against the wall whenever she moved forward when she was moving forward. It appeared as though she was confused and disoriented. Immediately after that, the camera caught her as she rounded a corner and entered a large kitchen that was constructed out of stainless steel. This kitchen was not used at all throughout the time that it was being restored. To put it another way, it was essentially abandoned to the point that it was practically abandoned. In the course of her journey around the empty kitchen, she came across ovens and counters that were not being utilized by anyone. It was at that very moment that she stepped away from the camera's line of sight, which was situated at the opposite end of the kitchen. When the shot was taken, she was no longer showing up. The authorities maintained their monitoring efforts, employing a number of different camera angles in their investigations. In contrast, she was never captured on any other camera again after that point in time. Following the time when she left the kitchen, there was no more sighting of her. Now that they had a specific location from which to carry out their duties, the authorities were completely aware of the tasks that they needed to complete. Following their departure from the security office, they dashed straight down to the basement of the hotel, where they remained until they were no longer in danger. The exact halls that Kanika had gone through a few hours earlier were traversed by them as they made their way through the same vacant corridors. After entering the kitchen, there was a complete lack of any noise whatsoever. At this point, they began their search. The clock was ticking down to 1 o'clock in the morning, and it was still far beyond midnight. It was precisely the morning of Sunday. It had been close to 24 hours since Kanika's friends had last seen her. This meant that some of them had not seen her in quite some time. In addition, the unfortunate finale of the search for Kanika Jenkins took place in the kitchen where she was being detained. The police officers saw a massive freezer that was accessible to the general population. It was possible for them to open the enormous passageway. In addition to that, they found Kanika hidden away. Her existence had come to an end. As a result of the study, the events that took place during the perplexing minutes that she was dying were pieced together. After she had parted ways with her friends, Kanika, who was in a state of acute intoxication, had drifted off into the distance. After making her way down, she entered the kitchen of the hotel's basement, which was absolutely devoid of any presence. A walk-in freezer of considerable size and of commercial quality had been left on and unlocked for reasons that we may never be able to fully comprehend. The freezer had been left on. There was a door that was open. Kanika, who was probably looking for a spot to relax or rest because she was lost, entered the entryway. She must have been looking for a location to do so. The heavy door, which was constructed to close tightly and was insulated, swung shut behind her once she had left the room. Due to the fact that the door had already been shut, it would have been incredibly challenging, if not impossible, for someone in her position to open the door from the inside. Despite the fact that the majority of current refrigerators come equipped with an integrated safety release mechanism, it is extremely plausible that Kanika was unable to locate it or even realize what was happening place. Her death was brought on by hypothermia, which was brought on by the fact that she was confined inside the icy environment. Kanika's death was determined to have been the consequence of an accident, according to the official verdict of the medical examiner. Alcohol and topiramate, a medication that is taken for epilepsy and migraines, were discovered as significant contributory factors when it was concluded that hypothermia was the cause of death. Hypothermia was also recognized as the cause of death. From the perspective of her family and a sizable portion of the broader public, however, the narrative was not as straightforward as it may have appeared. The announcement of her passing and the unusual circumstances that accompanied it aroused an anger of unparalleled proportions. Irreverent circumstances surrounded her passing. The information that was brought to light regarding the hotel, as well as the initial response that the police department provided to the matter, shocked and outraged the general population significantly. Internet sleuths and concerned individuals began investigating every piece of evidence that was available, and when the conspiracy theories involving the alleged foul play were initially published, they began to spread like wildfire throughout the internet. In the eyes of the general public, the concept that a young woman could accidentally find herself confined inside a freezer in a major hotel was just incomprehensible. Nevertheless, in spite of all the rumors and speculation, the investigators could not discover any evidence to suggest that anyone else was contributing to her passing after they conducted their investigation. The most significant and puzzling question that has not yet been answered, on the other hand, has nothing to do with a conspiracy. Time is the major concern in this scenario. On the day when Teresa, Kanika's mother, arrived at that motel, it had been just 2 hours since Kanika had vanished without a trace. Earlier, she had urged with the employees to have a look at the surveillance cameras. When she was in a difficult situation, she had pleaded with them to help her. They were not in agreement. The police, upon receiving her call, did not take her worries into consideration and instead asked her to wait for additional instructions. On the other hand, what if they had looked at it? What would have happened if, at 5 or 6 in the morning, when Teresa was the first person to raise the alarm, the workers at the hotel had simply gone through all of the footage? As a result of their presence, they would have seen Kanika making her way into the basement by accident. They might have found her in the kitchen, which was a possibility considering the circumstances. A maximum of a couple of hours would have been the maximum amount of time that she would have spent in the freezer prior to that crucial period. Not only is it conceivable that she would have been alive all along, but it is also a chance that she would have been alive if she had in fact been alive. Tragically, not only is it a tragedy that Kanika Jenkins lost away, but it is also a tragedy that she could have been prevented from passing away to such a big degree. There was a window of opportunity when a rescue could have been performed. Nevertheless, that window of opportunity was allowed to close. The string of failures, which included the hotel's refusal to comply and the police's initial lack of urgency, were the reasons why there was a window of chance. Almost immediately after the occurrence, Teresa Martin filed a lawsuit against the Crowne Plaza Hotel, the security company that was employed by the hotel, and the restaurant that was leasing the cooking space. Many millions of dollars were the subject of the complaint that was filed. It was alleged in the complaint that they were careless in the sense that they did not adequately lock a potentially hazardous place, which was the walk-in freezer. In addition, it was asserted that the fact that they did not respond promptly to her requests for assistance was a direct factor in the passing of her daughter. Following a protracted legal struggle, the matter was ultimately settled out of court for a sum that was estimated to be greater than $6 million. Despite this, there is no amount of money that will ever bring Kanika back or erase the dreadful what-ifs that will continue to afflict her family. Neither one of these items is feasible at this time. They are left with the disheartening reality that the system that was intended to protect individuals failed their daughter at every single point of the process. They discovered that they were in this predicament without knowledge. In the final eerie film, Kanika can be seen wandering through the hotel's chilly and deserted hallways by herself. This footage serves as a heartbreaking final tribute to a life that was cut too short. In addition to this, it serves as a sobering reminder of how a series of decisions made by bureaucrats that appear to be of little significance can result in the most disastrous of outcomes. I want to express my gratitude for your presence here today. If you watched the program that was broadcast today, I would appreciate it if you could share your ideas with me in the comments area. Also, bear in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime waiting for you to watch in one sitting right now. You may watch all of these episodes in one sitting. Till the next time we meet again, what's going on? One day in the year 1785, a young woman was writhing in extreme pain in a hospital bed at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, which was one of the largest and most advanced medical facilities in Scotland at the time. Now, despite this hospital being enormous and quite famous for its medical school, the room this woman was in was very small, and it was incredibly stark, too. The plaster walls were completely blank, the wooden floorboards were bare, and there was just a single window looking out into the damp, gray city. In fact, the only piece of furniture in this entire room was the cold metal bed that she was lying on. And this woman, as she was laying on this bed, was gripping the iron frame with all her strength. She was sweating profusely and shrieking in pain, feeling as though her body was being physically ripped in half. Surrounding her on all sides were several nurses who were anxiously watching her to see what was going to happen next. This woman was in labor, and she had been in labor for several agonizing hours. And so far, things were not going well at all. To understand why this was such a terrifying situation, you have to realize that giving birth in the 18th century looked a whole lot different than giving birth today. Primarily, this was because there were very limited pain management tools at the disposal of doctors and nurses. There were no epidurals, and there were no clean anesthetics. If a woman was experiencing severe pain, the medical staff basically only had liquid opium, which they called laudanum, and they would give that to the mother along with some strong alcohol like gin or whiskey. That was it. Beyond the lack of pain management, giving birth in the 18th century was far more dangerous to the mother than it is today. In modern times, it is practically unheard of, at least in the United Kingdom, for mothers to die while giving birth. The statistic today is something like 13 out of every 100,000 mothers dying during childbirth, which is about 0.01%. But in the 18th century, that rate was 30 times higher. Women died at a fairly regular clip while delivering babies, and it was something that every expecting mother feared. The reason for this high mortality rate was partly due to terrible sanitation. Back in the 18th century, germ theory did not exist, and it was not uncommon for doctors and nurses to completely skip washing their hands between patients. In fact, many doctors would walk straight from conducting autopsies on diseased corpses in the basement directly into the delivery room to help a woman give birth without ever washing their hands or changing their blood-stained clothes. Because of this, the spread of deadly diseases and bacteria, such as childbed fever, was incredibly high. On top of that, when it came to actual physical complications during labor, there were very few solutions available to the medical staff. So, when this young woman first showed up at the Royal Infirmary after her water broke, she was naturally terrified. She knew she had to deliver this child, but she also knew the very real risks of dying in that hospital bed. When she first arrived, the staff took her in quickly. They guided her down the dark stone hallways, brought her into this small, stark room, and laid her down on the metal bed. At first, it seemed like everything was going to be completely normal. The nurses and doctors did this every day, and even though it was a risky process, they acted like her delivery would be standard. For the first few hours, she lay in the bed and the nurses checked on her periodically. Everything seemed fine. But then, the contractions began to intensify. The staff gathered around her bed and started encouraging her to push. She pushed with all her might, over and over again, for hours. But she was not progressing. No matter how hard she tried, the baby was not moving. After a careful examination, the medical staff determined that there was a major complication. The baby's skull was simply too large to pass through her pelvic opening. The baby was completely stuck in her birth canal. By 18th century standards, this was an absolute emergency. It was a worst-case scenario. Both the mother's life and the baby's life were now in immediate danger. If this exact situation happened today, the doctors would simply perform an emergency cesarean section, and both the mother and the baby would likely be completely fine. But back in 1785, while cesarean sections did technically exist, they were incredibly dangerous. They were only used as a last resort when the mother was already dead or guaranteed to die, just to try and save the baby. Because of this, the medical staff did not want to perform a cesarean section, and the mother certainly did not want one either. She was screaming in agony, completely exhausted, and the room had devolved into absolute chaos. The nurses were panic-stricken, and the situation was looking incredibly grim. At that point, one of the nurses realized they needed to get immediate expert help. She ran out of the room, hurried down the long hallway, and returned a few minutes later with a gray-haired surgeon. This surgeon walked into the chaotic, loud room, taking in the scene of bodily fluids, screaming, and panic. He walked right over to the terrified woman, looked down at her, and tried to calm her down. He told her that everything was going to be fine. He promised her that her pain and this miserable situation would be over in just a moment. Most importantly, he told her that both she and her baby were going to survive because he had a brand new piece of technology that was going to save their lives. This surgeon was Dr. John Aitken. He was one of the leading doctors at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, and he was a true pioneer in the field of obstetrics and childbirth. His entire career was focused on finding new ways to make childbirth safer and less painful for women, with the ultimate goal of lowering the incredibly high maternal mortality rate. Recently, Dr. Aitken had been working on a specific invention designed for this exact emergency when a baby became physically stuck in the birth canal. He had spent months developing this new piece of technology, and now he had the perfect opportunity to put it to use. When he explained to the distraught, exhausted woman that he had a tool that would fix everything, she could barely focus on his words. All she understood was that her pain was going to stop, her baby was going to be safe, and she was going to live. She was incredibly relieved, whispering "thank you" over and over again. Dr. Aitken then turned and left the room to retrieve his new invention. But when he walked back into the room holding the instrument, the woman's relief instantly turned into absolute horror. The tool he was holding looked incredibly barbaric, like something designed for torture rather than medicine. The woman began to panic. She tried to scramble backward on the bed, desperately trying to get away from the doctor and this terrifying tool. But the nurses immediately stepped in. They grabbed her arms and legs, holding her down and essentially pinning her to the metal bed so she could not move. Dr. Aitken told her to hold still, saying that they were ready to begin. He then activated the instrument. The woman was already in blinding, unimaginable pain from hours of obstructed labor, but when Dr. Aitken applied the tool to her body, the pain became infinitely worse. It was so intense that she felt herself slipping into an out-of-body experience, convinced that she was actively dying. But then, just when she felt she could not take another second of the agony, the pain suddenly began to fade. The room grew quiet, and through the haze, she heard a sound she did not expect to hear. It was the sharp, clear sound of a baby crying. Her baby had been successfully extracted, and against all odds, her baby was completely healthy and safe. And amazingly, the woman was going to be okay too. Dr. John Aitken's horrifying new tool had actually worked perfectly, and it had saved both of their lives. The procedure that this young woman had just undergone was known as a symphysiotomy. This was a surgical procedure that had actually been around since the 17th century, used specifically when a baby was completely stuck in the birth canal. The way a symphysiotomy worked was highly invasive and brutal. The surgeon would have to go in and physically sever the pubic symphysis, which is the thick cartilage joint that connects the left and right sides of the pelvis. By cutting through this joint, the pelvis would widen, expanding the birth canal and allowing the baby to be delivered. Usually, this was done with a standard scalpel, which took a long time, caused massive tissue damage, and led to severe complications and infections. But Dr. John Aitken had invented a tool to make this brutal procedure much faster, more targeted, and far more efficient. His invention featured a fine, flexible steel chain with tiny, sharp, serrated teeth. This chain was wrapped around a guide bar and connected to a hand crank. By turning the hand crank, the surgeon could make the chain rotate rapidly, allowing it to cut through the tough cartilage of the pubic symphysis joint in a matter of seconds, rather than minutes. It was still an incredibly painful and invasive procedure, but because it was so fast, the survival rates for both mothers and babies skyrocketed. Despite how terrifying the tool looked, it caught on incredibly quickly. It became the standard medical instrument for performing symphysiotomies in hospitals all across Europe. For over a century, doctors relied on this rotating chain tool to save lives during difficult deliveries. It remained a staple of obstetrics until the turn of the 20th century. At that point, advancements in antiseptics, anesthesia, and surgical techniques made cesarean sections much safer and far more reliable. Because C-sections were no longer a death sentence, the need for symphysiotomies decreased dramatically, and Dr. Aitken's surgical tool eventually faded into obscurity. However, the story of this medical device did not end there. A completely different group of people who had absolutely nothing to do with medicine eventually came across the design of Dr. Aitken's tool. This group was lumberjacks. They realized that this surgical instrument, which had been engineered to rapidly cut through tough human bone and cartilage, would be incredibly effective at cutting through wood. They took the basic concept of the rotating chain with sharp teeth, scaled it up, added a motorized engine, and used it to fell massive trees. It turns out that the life-saving medical device Dr. John Aitken invented to help women give birth was actually the world's very first chainsaw. Now, let us travel forward in time to the summer of 1904, to a bustling city across the Atlantic Ocean. One night in Chicago, Illinois, a young woman named Anna Gray was lying in her bed. She was staying in a second-story room at a quiet bed and breakfast in the city. Anna was traveling, and after a long day of walking around, she had hoped to get a good night of rest. But she found herself completely unable to sleep. She tossed and turned, unable to find a comfortable position. At first, Anna could not quite figure out why she was so restless. But as she lay there in the quiet room, she realized her stomach was feeling incredibly upset. Earlier that evening, she had eaten a rich, heavy minced meat pie, and it was not digesting well. Her stomach was rumbling and growling loudly, causing her a lot of physical discomfort. On top of that, the air in her bedroom was incredibly stuffy and stagnant. It was the height of the Chicago summer, and without any air circulation, the heat in the room was almost suffocating. Eventually, Anna became so frustrated by her inability to sleep that she decided she needed to do something. She threw the heavy blankets off her body, got out of bed, and walked over to the wooden window. She unlocked it and pushed the sash upward, opening it wide to let in the cool night air. As she stood by the open window, the fresh breeze hit her face, and she immediately felt a little bit better. Even though her stomach was still upset, the circulation of fresh air made the room feel much more bearable. Feeling a sudden wave of exhaustion wash over her, Anna decided it was time to try sleeping again. She left the window wide open, walked back to her bed, climbed in, and pulled the sheets up to her shoulders. Within just a few minutes, she drifted off into a deep sleep. But several hours later, in the dead of night, Anna suddenly woke up. Her eyes snapped open, and she sat up in bed, her heart racing. At first, she was completely disoriented. In the darkness of the unfamiliar room, she couldn't remember where she was. Then, she remembered she was at the bed and breakfast in Chicago and that she was scheduled to travel back home the very next day. But as she lay there trying to calm her racing heart, she felt a deep, chilling sensation. She had a strong, instinctual feeling that something was completely wrong. The room was totally silent, but she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if she were not alone. Anna slowly turned her head and scanned the dark room. Everything seemed to be in its proper place. There was no sign of an intruder, and nothing looked out of the ordinary. But as her eyes scanned the room a second time, they stopped on the open window. Sitting right there on the windowsill was a man. He was perched on the ledge, looking directly into the room, staring right at her. He was completely motionless, unflinching, and his eyes were locked onto hers with a cold, blank stare. In an instant, Anna's mind began to race with terrifying thoughts. She realized this man must have climbed up the side of the building to her second-story window, and she was convinced he was there to hurt her. She wondered if she was trapped in a horrific nightmare or if this was actually happening. She felt a wave of pure panic wash over her. Usually, when people find themselves in a terrifying situation like this, their instinct is to freeze, scream, or try to run away. But Anna's instinct was completely different. Her fight-or-flight response told her to fight. In a fraction of a second, without even thinking, she threw off her blankets and leaped out of bed, lunging forward to confront the intruder. But as she lunged toward the window, the man did not flinch or react with fear. Instead, he did something incredibly bizarre. He slowly and delicately leaned backward, off the windowsill, and fell out of the window into the darkness below. Anna was stunned. She realized that they were on the second floor, and a fall from that height could easily be fatal. Despite her terror, she ran to the open window and leaned out, expecting to see a badly injured man lying on the ground below. But when she looked down, she was shocked to see that the ground was completely empty. There was no one there. Anna looked around frantically, wondering if the man had somehow landed on his feet and run away, or if he was hiding against the side of the house. But there was absolutely no sign of him. She was completely alone in the quiet night. Then, as she kept watching the street, she noticed a long, dark vehicle parked directly underneath a streetlight a short distance away. She couldn't remember if that vehicle had been parked there earlier, but it looked incredibly out of place. As she stared at the vehicle, she saw movement in the front seat. The driver of the vehicle leaned down low, peering up through the windshield directly at Anna. When his face caught the light of the street lamp, Anna felt her blood run cold. It was the exact same man who had just been sitting in her windowsill a moment ago. As she watched in disbelief, the man extended his hand out of the driver's side window. He looked up at her and began to slowly beckon to her with his finger, gesturing for her to come down to the street and get into the vehicle with him. It was then that Anna realized what kind of vehicle he was driving. It was a hearse. Overwhelmed by absolute terror, Anna jumped back from the window, slammed it shut, and pulled the heavy curtains closed. She tried to convince herself that this was not real, that she had to be hallucinating. After a few seconds, though, she realized she needed to know if the man was still out there. She crept back to the window, parted the curtains slightly, and looked down at the street. The hearse and the mysterious man were completely gone. The street was empty. Anna spent the rest of the night sitting upright in her bed, unable to sleep. She watched the window constantly, terrified that the man might return. But he did not. Eventually, as the hours dragged on, she fell into a light, uneasy sleep. When she opened her eyes again, the room was filled with bright morning sunlight. The terror of the night seemed to fade in the warm light of day. Anna sat up and thought about what had happened. She reasoned that it was simply impossible for a man to fall out of a second-story window without making a sound, disappear instantly, and then reappear inside a hearse. She decided that the entire experience must have been an incredibly vivid, terrifying nightmare brought on by her indigestion and the stuffy room. Relieved by this logical explanation, Anna got dressed, packed her things, and left the bed and breakfast. She decided to spend her final day in Chicago enjoying herself. She walked downtown to a grand, newly opened department store. The store was massive, spanning 4 floors, and it was bustling with shoppers, beautiful displays, and vibrant energy. For the next several hours, Anna had a wonderful time. She walked from floor to floor, browsing the items, making a few purchases, and completely forgetting about the terrifying events of the night before. By the afternoon, she had finished her shopping and decided it was time to leave for the train station. She walked over to the elevator on the 4th floor to take it down to the ground level. In those days, elevators were manual and required an operator to open the doors and control the movement of the car. Anna pressed the button and stood waiting. After a few moments, she heard a ding, and the heavy metal doors slid open. Inside, the elevator car was absolutely packed with people. There were shoppers squeezed shoulder to shoulder, and there was barely any room left. Like most polite people would do, Anna waved her hand at the crowd and told them to go ahead without her. She said she would simply wait for the next elevator. She expected the doors to close and the car to descend, leaving her to wait in peace. But the doors did not close. Instead, a rude, demanding man's voice called out from inside the car, telling her that there was room for one more and insisting that she get in. Anna was taken aback by the harsh tone. She looked into the crowded elevator, trying to see who had spoken. Her eyes traveled to the front of the car, where the elevator operator was standing. When he leaned forward, it was the exact same man from the night before. The man from her windowsill. The man from the hearse. Anna gasped in pure horror. She stepped backward, shaking her head, and cried out that she was not getting in. The passengers in the elevator looked at her with confusion, wondering why she was reacting so strongly. The operator simply scoffed at her, pulled the control lever, and the heavy doors slid closed, hiding his face from view. The elevator began its descent. Anna stood near the elevator shaft, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to tell herself that she was being ridiculous, that it was just a coincidence, and that the operator simply looked like the man from her nightmare. But just a few seconds later, a horrific sound echoed from inside the elevator shaft. It was a loud, metallic snapping noise, followed by the screeching of metal on metal, and then the terrifying, blood-curdling screams of the passengers. The elevator's cable had snapped. The car plummeted 4 stories, crashing violently into the basement below. The impact was catastrophic. 2 passengers were killed instantly, and several others were severely injured. Anna stood on the 4th floor, completely frozen in shock. If she had ignored her fear and stepped into that elevator, she would have been inside the car when it fell. Her bizarre experience the night before, whether it was a premonition, a ghost, or a warning from another world, had saved her life. She later spoke to police and reporters, and her incredible story was widely published in newspapers across the country, leaving people to wonder about the true nature of the mysterious hearse driver. Now, let us travel many years into the future, to the morning of July 5th, 2008. We find ourselves in Bishopstoke, which is a small, quiet village located in southern England. On this morning, a 50-year-old man named David File was walking up the stairs to his apartment. David's apartment was located in a massive residential complex that took up an entire city block. The complex consisted of several 2-story buildings. When David had first moved into his apartment 8 years earlier, the complex was a wonderful place to live. It was clean, well-maintained, and filled with friendly neighbors. It was a thriving, bustling community. But over the years, the property had fallen into extreme disrepair. The grounds were overgrown with weeds, the walls were covered in graffiti, and garbage was piled up in the courtyards. Most of the windows in the buildings were boarded up with thick plywood. The complex looked completely abandoned, and in many ways, it was. It turned out that David File was literally the last remaining tenant in the entire complex. There were 72 apartments in total, but 71 of them were completely empty and boarded up. David was the only person left living in the massive, decaying ghost town. As David reached his front door on this morning, he noticed a piece of white paper taped to the wood. He pulled it off and read the words. It was an official eviction notice. The owners of the property were ordering him to pack his belongings and leave immediately. David was filled with anger. He crumpled the paper in his hand, unlocked his door, and stepped inside his apartment. His living room was incredibly cramped, and it was dominated by a massive, full-size billiard table that took up almost the entire space. This apartment was David's home, and he loved it. He had spent 8 years of his life here, and he simply did not want to leave. David walked into his kitchen and tossed the eviction notice onto a large pile of papers on his counter. Almost all of those papers were letters from a company called Atlantic Housing, which was the development firm that owned the apartment complex. 2 years earlier, Atlantic Housing had decided to demolish the entire complex to clear the land for a new development project. They had offered financial payouts and relocation assistance to all 72 tenants to encourage them to move out. Every single tenant had accepted the offer and moved away, except for David. He had flatly refused to leave his home. Atlantic Housing had tried everything to get him to budge. They offered him more money, they tried to find him alternative housing, and they pleaded with him to cooperate. But David stood his ground. Eventually, the company ran out of patience and decided to take legal action. They sued David to force him out. The legal battle dragged on for 2 years, but ultimately, the court ruled in favor of Atlantic Housing. The judge granted the company the right to evict David from the property. David knew this day was coming, but he simply could not bring himself to accept it. He felt that the system had treated him unfairly, and he was filled with despair. As he looked around his beloved apartment, he decided that he was not going to let them simply throw him out. He decided to stage a protest. But he didn't want a quiet, simple protest. He wanted to do something so extreme, so shocking, that the entire country would be forced to pay attention to his story and realize how wrong the eviction was. He knew exactly what he was going to do. Later that afternoon, David walked over to his storage closet and gathered his supplies. He pulled out a length of thick rope, an automatic electric timer plug, and a heavy-duty electric chainsaw. He carried these items into his living room, right next to his massive billiard table. David then began to meticulously construct an incredibly elaborate and horrific trap. He placed the heavy electric chainsaw on the edge of the billiard table. Using the thick rope, he bound the body of the chainsaw securely to one of the heavy wooden legs of the table. He tied the knots tightly, ensuring that the tool was locked in place and could not move or vibrate out of position. The guide bar of the chainsaw was positioned so that it jutted out horizontally, parallel to the floor, at the exact height of a person's neck if they were lying down on the floor next to the table. David then plugged the chainsaw's power cord into the automatic electric timer, which was plugged into the wall outlet. He set the timer so that the power would turn on at a specific time later that evening. Once the setup was complete, David lay down on the floor. He positioned his neck directly against the sharp, stationary teeth of the chainsaw's chain, and he waited. A few hours later, David's parents were growing increasingly worried about him. They had been trying to reach him on his phone all afternoon, but he was not answering their calls. Knowing that the eviction was scheduled for that day, and knowing how distressed their son was, they decided to drive over to his apartment to check on him. When they arrived at the decaying, silent apartment complex, they climbed the stairs to David's second-story unit. They knocked loudly on the front door and called out his name, but there was no response. As they stood in the quiet hallway, however, they heard a strange, low mechanical buzzing sound coming from inside the apartment. The sound was deeply unsettling, and combined with David's silence, his parents feared the worst. They immediately called the police for help. 2 police officers arrived at the scene a short time later. They knocked on the door and announced themselves, but they also received no answer. Like David's parents, the officers could hear the strange, continuous, mechanical whirring sound coming from inside the unit. Fearing that David might be in danger, the officers decided to use force to enter the apartment. One of the officers stepped back, raised his foot, and kicked the front door with all his strength. The wooden door splintered and flew open. As soon as the door opened, the low, whirring sound suddenly became a deafening, roaring shriek. The officers and David's parents rushed inside, but as soon as they looked into the living room, they froze in absolute horror. David's trap had functioned exactly as he had designed it. The automatic electric timer had turned on the power, and the heavy-duty chainsaw had roared to life. David had remained perfectly still, allowing the spinning chain to sever his head. The scene was incredibly gruesome, and David's parents were completely devastated by the horrific sight of their son's ultimate tragic protest. Despite the sheer horror of his death, David's final act did achieve the widespread attention he had wanted. The story of the last tenant of Bishopstoke made headlines all across the United Kingdom. People were deeply shocked by the lengths to which David had gone to protest his eviction. But in the end, his sacrifice did not change the fate of his home. Shortly after his tragic death, the police finished their investigation, and the apartment complex was completely cleared. Within a few weeks, heavy machinery arrived, and the entire block of buildings, including the apartment David had died to protect, was demolished. Let us look back at the incredible journey of these stories and the deep mysteries they leave behind. In 1785, a young woman faced the terrifying prospect of 18th-century childbirth, only to be saved by a radical new invention. That invention, designed to cut through bone and cartilage to preserve human life, would eventually be adapted by lumberjacks in the forests of Europe and North America. It is a striking irony of history that a tool now associated with danger and destruction began as a life-saving medical device in a Scottish hospital. And then we look at the strange case of Anna Gray in 1904. Her story remains one of the most famous examples of a premonition in American history. Was the mysterious man in her window a spectral messenger, a guardian angel, or simply a trick of her mind that coincidentally saved her from a terrible disaster. The coincidence of seeing the exact same face on the elevator operator just hours before the cable snapped is something that science cannot easily explain. It leaves us with a haunting question about whether some people are given a warning before tragedy strikes, and whether we would have the courage to listen to our instincts the way Anna did. Finally, we have the tragic story of David File in 2008. His extreme protest highlights the intense psychological toll that displacement and isolation can have on a person. Being the very last resident in a massive abandoned housing complex, David felt completely abandoned by the system. His determination to make his voice heard led him to construct a horrific device using the very tool that had evolved from Dr. Aitken's 18th-century medical breakthrough. It is a dark, tragic connection across centuries, showing how a tool meant for saving lives became an instrument of ultimate self-destruction. The legacy of these events continues to echo through time. The Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh eventually moved to a modern facility, and the original building was repurposed, but the medical pioneers who worked there changed the course of history. The department store in Chicago, where the elevator fell, was eventually renovated, and modern safety regulations were put in place to ensure that such a catastrophic mechanical failure would never happen again. The site of David File's apartment in Bishopstoke now stands as a symbol of the friction between corporate development and individual lives, a quiet spot where a man made a final, devastating stand. These stories remind us that the world is full of strange connections, unexpected warnings, and tragic choices. Whether it is the evolution of a surgical saw into a powerful lumberjack tool, a mysterious figure preventing a young woman from entering a doomed elevator, or a lonely man choosing an extreme method to defend his home, the human experience is filled with moments that defy simple explanation. They challenge our understanding of history, technology, and the deep, often hidden forces that shape our lives. As we think about these events, we are reminded of the fragility of our existence. The young woman in Edinburgh could have easily become another statistic in the high mortality rate of 18th-century childbirth, but a breakthrough in technology saved her. Anna Gray could have easily stepped onto that crowded elevator, but a gut-wrenching feeling kept her safe on the 4th floor. David File could have found another way to express his grief and anger, but he chose a path of no return, leaving a haunting memory for his family and his community. The investigations into these events have long been closed, the files stored away in historical archives and police records, but the narratives live on, passed down through generations as warnings and mysteries. They remind us to look closer at the tools we use, the feelings we experience in the middle of the night, and the desperate struggles of those who feel they have nowhere left to turn. In the end, we are left to ponder the thin line between life and death, and how a single decision, a single invention, or a single moment of fear can change everything forever. The past is not just a collection of dates and facts, but a tapestry of real people facing unimaginable circumstances, leaving behind legacies that continue to intrigue and mystify us to this day. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the afternoon of the 10th of April, 1998, a 40-year-old woman named Diane Auget stood at a bar inside the Hayloft Tavern. It was a small local spot in Hudson, Florida. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, or at least they think they do. Diane held a glass in her hand. She brought it to her lips and downed the last few sips of her drink. Her vision was starting to get blurry, and a wave of nausea rolled through her stomach. But she didn't care. In fact, that was kind of the point. She yelled out to the bartender, her voice slurred and thick, telling him to bring her another round. She wanted to get so drunk that she could forget everything. Because right then, her life felt like a complete disaster. It hadn't always been this way. Not too long ago, Diane had been a married stay-at-home mother. She had 3 kids, and they were her entire world. She loved them more than anything. But about 10 years before this night at the bar, her life had taken a very difficult turn. She started having very serious mental health problems. After a long and difficult process, she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. It was a heavy diagnosis, one that came with a whole new set of challenges. She would fall into these deep, dark depressions. They were so powerful they would make it almost impossible for her to function, to even get out of bed in the morning. Then, like a switch would flip, she would swing into these intense manic episodes. These would keep her awake for days on end, leaving her so delirious and exhausted that she would start talking to herself, seeing things that weren't there. Living with this was incredibly hard, not just for Diane, but for her family. Eventually, the strain became too much. Her husband divorced her, and in the custody battle that followed, he was awarded full custody of their children. Losing her kids, even if she understood why, was a blow that Diane never fully recovered from. By 1998, her life had sort of leveled off into a new, difficult normal. She was living with her sister, which provided some support and a roof over her head. But her bipolar disorder was far from under control. She had medication for it, but she wasn't always consistent about taking it. So, the cycles continued. The crushing lows of depression, followed by the chaotic highs of mania. She had been in and out of various psychiatric facilities more times than her family could count. Each time, they hoped it would be the one that finally helped her find stability. But it never seemed to stick. So, on this particular night, April 10th, Diane was in a dark place. She just wanted to numb the pain, to drown her sorrows, and make the world go quiet for a little while. A couple of hours earlier, she had left her sister's house. She didn't say where she was going. She didn't own a car, so she just started walking. Her feet eventually carried her to the Hayloft Tavern. And for the past couple of hours, she had been standing there, mostly by herself, pacing in circles and drinking alone. Just then, the bartender came back over to her side of the bar. Diane was seeing double, but she could clearly see that he wasn't carrying another drink for her. His hands were empty. He had a look on his face that was half annoyed, half sympathetic. He told her he was cutting her off, that she'd had enough. Diane was furious. The feeling of humiliation washed over her. She started to argue with him, telling him he didn't know what he was talking about, that she was fine, but the bartender just held up his hands and stood his ground. He was sorry, he said, but she was cut off. There was a finality in his voice. Defeated and angry, Diane turned and stumbled out of the bar, disappearing into the Florida night. The next day, April 11th, Diane's mother, Mildred, was pacing back and forth inside her living room. She held a phone pressed tightly to her ear, listening to it ring. After a couple of rings, a dispatcher from the local police department answered. In a shaky voice, Mildred told them she needed to report her daughter, Diane, as a missing person. A little while earlier, Mildred had gotten a call from her other daughter, the one Diane was living with. She said that Diane had left the house the night before and still hadn't come home. She hadn't called, hadn't left a note, nothing. Given Diane's history of mental illness and her often erratic behavior, Mildred's mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. She felt a deep, cold pit of fear in her stomach. Her daughter had to be in some kind of trouble. On the phone with the police dispatcher, Mildred explained the whole situation. She said that yes, it was possible that Diane had just left on her own for some reason. But it was just as possible, if not more so, that she was having a manic episode. When that happened, Diane could become disoriented. She might have wandered off and gotten lost, with no idea how to get back home. The dispatcher was calm and professional. She assured Mildred that she would send officers to interview her and her other daughter right away. They would start looking for Diane immediately. But 4 days went by. 4 long, agonizing days. And on April 15th, there was still no sign of Diane. That afternoon, Mildred went down to the police station. It was a trip she had made every single day since her daughter had disappeared, hoping for any scrap of news. But just like all the other days, the police didn't have any new information for her. They told her what little they knew, which wasn't much. They had confirmed that on the night of April 10th, after leaving her sister's house, Diane had gone to the Hayloft Tavern. They spoke to the bartender, who confirmed he had cut her off because she was incredibly drunk. He said she had walked out of the bar, and that was the last he saw of her. Investigators had also found a couple of people who had seen Diane the following day, on April 11th. She had been sighted walking along Highway 19, which was just a couple of miles away from the tavern. Another witness spotted her near a locally owned motel right off the highway, a place called the Coral Sands Motel. But after that, the trail went cold. The police told Mildred they had no idea what happened to Diane after that. They didn't know where she could have gone or what could have happened to her. Mildred left the police station feeling a profound sense of disappointment and fear. The drive home was a blur. Her mind was racing, playing out all the terrible possibilities. Was her daughter hiding somewhere on purpose? Had she gotten lost and was now hurt, hungry, and alone? Or had she run into the wrong person? Had she been kidnapped? Or worse? These scenarios tormented her, each one more terrifying than the last. Finally, she pulled into her driveway and went inside. She sat down on her couch, exhausted, and tried to think about what she could possibly do next. And that's when she noticed it. The little red light on her answering machine was blinking. She had a new voicemail. Mildred thought maybe it was her other daughter, calling with an update while she was out. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something to do with Diane. She got up, walked over to the machine, and pressed the play button. What she heard next made her blood run cold. It was Diane's voice, and she sounded absolutely terrified. Through the static of the machine, Mildred could hear her daughter crying out, "Help! Let me out!" Then there was a scuffling sound on the recording, like someone had grabbed the phone away from Diane. Mildred heard Diane say something like, "Hey, give me that," and then the call just cut off. The line went dead. After hearing the message, Mildred went into a total panic. Her worst fears were no longer just possibilities in her head. They felt real. It sounded like her daughter was in terrible immediate danger. Shaking with anxiety and fear, she grabbed the answering machine and looked at the small display for the caller ID, desperate to see who had left this horrifying message. But all it said was that the call had come in from a place called Starlight. The name meant nothing to Mildred. She quickly dialed the number back, her heart pounding in her chest, praying that someone would pick up. But no one answered. The phone just rang and rang. With trembling hands, Mildred called the police. This voicemail changed everything. It was now obvious to the police that Diane hadn't just left on purpose, and she wasn't just lost. Based on that recording, it sounded like she had been kidnapped and was being held somewhere against her will. But the question was, where? The police had no idea. They tried to trace the call, but they couldn't pinpoint a specific location. And they couldn't figure out what Starlight was either. Was it a business? A nickname for a location? They had no leads. So, for another full day, despite this terrifying new clue, the investigation stalled. There just wasn't much to go on. That is, until the next afternoon. On April 16th, 5 days after Diane had disappeared, the police got a call. It was from a man who said he had just been walking along the side of Highway 19. He told the dispatcher he had found something disturbing lying in the grass. He said he wasn't even sure if the object was real, but it looked so troubling that he thought the police should come and check it out, just in case. Police immediately rushed out to the location. They met the man, who showed them what he had found. The officers carefully collected the object and sent it off to the crime lab for testing. Then they waited. When the analysis came back, they learned two things. First, the object was definitely real. And second, it belonged to Diane Augat. It was the severed tip of her finger from her right hand. Over the next few years, the case of Diane Augat grew colder but stranger. People would occasionally call in sightings of her to the police in Florida. Investigators looked into every single tip. They interviewed more than 100 people, chasing down every possible lead. But nothing ever panned out. The police never figured out what Starlight was, the mysterious place where that desperate voicemail had originated. And they never determined how or why Diane's finger was cut off and left by the side of the highway. But despite the lack of answers, strange clues that were definitely tied to Diane kept turning up in the most bizarre places. For example, the manager of a convenience store near where Diane lived found a plastic bag inside their store's outdoor freezer. Inside the bag were Diane's clothes, all neatly folded. Who would put them there, and why? Another time, a customer at a different nearby convenience store found another plastic bag that had been left behind on a countertop. This bag was full of toiletries, including eyeliner, perfume, and lipstick. And on the outside of the bag, scrawled in marker, was the name Diane. Police were never able to figure out who placed either of the bags or what they were supposed to mean. Unfortunately, today, more than 2 decades later, Diane's case remains unsolved. Her family has never stopped looking for answers. Around 3:30 inches the afternoon on the 17th of December, 1927, a 21-year-old sailor named Joe Stevens stood inside a U.S. Navy submarine. The vessel was cruising silently underwater in Cape Cod Bay, about a mile off the coast of Massachusetts. Joe was at the very front of the submarine, stationed inside a small, windowless compartment known as the torpedo room. It was about 20 feet long and 10 feet wide. On one side, a heavy metal door stood open, leading out to the rest of the sub. The walls of the room were lined with 6 bunks for the crew, a tangled mess of machinery, and several long, menacing torpedoes. Despite the cramped and dark conditions, Joe was absolutely thrilled to be there. Working on a submarine had been his dream for as long as he could remember. When he was just a little kid, he had actually built his own periscope out of a piece of wood. A periscope on a real submarine is like a long set of binoculars that can be raised up from the sub. It allows the crew to be just below the surface of the water, hidden from view, while the periscope pokes just barely out of the water to see what's going on around them. With this fake wooden periscope, Joe and his older sister, Florence, would spend hours and hours pretending they were on a submarine deep underwater, going on all sorts of secret and important missions. So, years later, when Joe turned 18, remember, the very first thing he did was enlist in the Navy. And just recently, he had finally been assigned to work on this exact submarine. For Joe, it was literally his childhood dream coming true. On this particular day, Joe was taking part in one of his very first test sails. The mission was simple. He and the other 40 men on board were just running through drills, testing all the different machinery to make sure everything was in perfect working order. Joe and 5 other men had been assigned to the torpedo room. They were standing by, waiting for a command from their captain to come through on the one-way intercom system overhead. But as they were standing there, waiting in the quiet hum of the submarine, something happened. Out of nowhere, Joe heard a loud, grating, metallic sound. It echoed through the entire submarine, a horrible screech of metal against metal. The sub itself shook so violently from the impact that Joe and the other men were thrown off their feet, falling hard to the metal floor. Immediately, Joe and his coworkers scrambled to get up. They looked at each other with wide, confused eyes, all thinking the same thing. What was that? But before they could even say a word, their worst nightmare began to unfold. A torrent of seawater began to rush through that open door, flooding in from the rest of the submarine and into the torpedo room. As this absolutely horrifying scenario was playing out, Joe's immediate reaction was a strange and overwhelming sense of déjà vu. For just a split second, he felt like he had experienced this exact moment before. But before he could even process that bizarre feeling, a couple of his coworkers rushed past him. They managed to get to the door that connected the torpedo room to the rest of the submarine, and with all their strength, they slammed it shut and sealed it tight. At that point, Joe was snapped back to reality. He wasn't thinking about the feeling of déjà vu anymore. He was focused on what was happening. He realized there must have been some kind of terrible accident. Everyone in the room thought the same thing. That horrible grating sound, the shaking, the rushing water, it could only mean one thing. Something had struck their submarine. He expected to hear the captain's voice come over the intercom at any second, not to continue the test run, but with urgent orders about what they should do now that a real-world emergency was happening. And so, for a couple of minutes, Joe and his 5 fellow sailors just sat there in the now sealed-off torpedo room, waiting in silence for that announcement. But there was nothing. Just the sound of their own breathing and the faint creaks of the submarine. And then they all felt a final, heavy jolt, as if the entire submarine had just settled at the bottom of the bay. At first, Joe and the 5 other sailors didn't panic. They knew that whatever had happened was not good. It was serious. But they figured it wasn't a total catastrophe just yet. It was bad, but maybe they could be saved. After all, they were only about a mile away from the nearest Coast Guard station. And even though Joe and the others inside the torpedo room had no way to communicate with the outside world from where they were, they assumed that someone in the other parts of the submarine would be able to send out a distress call to the Coast Guard. They figured help was already on its way. But the minutes slowly turned into hours. And there was no progress. There was no sign that any sort of rescue was underway. They heard nothing over the intercom. They couldn't even hear any sounds from the other side of the sealed door. They thought that by now, surely one of their comrades would have come over and knocked or tried to talk to them in some way. But there was only silence. To make matters worse, the emergency lights inside the torpedo room eventually flickered and died, plunging them into total darkness. They were trapped at the bottom of the bay in a sealed metal room with no light. They also had no food and no water. All the supplies were in the other part of the submarine, but they couldn't risk opening the door. More water could come rushing in. They were completely and utterly trapped. All of that was horrible, but the scariest part of the whole situation was something they all knew but didn't want to say out loud. There was a finite amount of oxygen inside that sealed room. And with every single breath they took, they were using up that precious air supply. Pretty soon, that tiny metal torpedo room started to feel less like a part of a submarine and more like an underwater coffin. Joe began fading in and out of sleep. He lost all track of time in the endless dark. And with each passing hour, he was starting to lose hope. But then, suddenly, Joe heard a sound. It was a loud, metallic, clanging sound. He realized someone was knocking on the outside of the submarine. Their rescue had begun. Joe and the others immediately jumped out of their bunks, knocking into each other in the pitch-black room. They scrambled over to the hull of the sub and began knocking back, signaling to whoever was out there that they were alive. They were still in there. By using Morse code, which is a method of communication that uses a series of taps, Joe was able to have a conversation with the people outside. He confirmed that they were Coast Guard rescue divers. And they told Joe what had happened. They explained that about 16 hours earlier, a Coast Guard ship had accidentally struck their submarine. The collision had punctured the hull, and the submarine had sunk to the bottom. Everyone else on board, besides Joe and the 5 men with him in the torpedo room, had drowned. When Joe and the others heard this news, it was horrifying. But at the same time, they were hit with a wave of relief. Had they not sealed that door as fast as they did, they would be dead too. They were so incredibly lucky to be alive. So, after hearing this message, Joe began frantically knocking back a new message. He basically said, well, that's great, but when are you going to get us out of here? He explained that they were running out of air, that it was getting harder and harder to breathe. But the rescue divers could only tell him that they were doing their best. They would get them up as soon as they possibly could. And this was true. The Coast Guard was genuinely doing everything they could to save them. But the reality was, this was a really, really difficult problem. You have 6 people trapped inside a small air pocket deep underwater. If you try to open any part of the submarine, the immense pressure of the ocean would cause water to rush in so quickly that it would kill everyone inside instantly. So that wasn't an option. You also had the ticking clock. As Joe had said, they were running out of air. This meant there was a very compressed timeline to figure this out. So really, the only option was to somehow lift the entire submarine with everyone still inside and raise it to the surface. But this was 1927. This would be a complicated thing to do even with modern technology, let alone nearly 100 years ago. But it was their best and only chance. The plan was to bring in multiple ships with different kinds of heavy-duty lifts and somehow scoop up the submarine and bring it to the surface before everyone inside suffocated. But there was another problem. Just as they began to organize all these ships, a huge storm rolled in. The surface of the ocean was now being battered by extremely high winds, making it nearly impossible to position the ships and their lifting equipment. And unfortunately, the weather forecast said this storm was going to rage for days. While this catastrophe was playing out off the coast of Massachusetts, about 100 miles away in Providence, Rhode Island, Joe's older sister, Florence, opened up a newspaper. She read yet another article about the sunken submarine where she knew her little brother was trapped. For the last couple of days, Florence had been absolutely glued to her radio and the newspapers, desperate for any piece of good news. But every article, every news segment, said the same thing. The 6 men trapped inside the sub were still alive. They were communicating with the divers. But the storm on the surface was still too intense to rescue them. Florence felt so scared for her brother, and it wasn't just because the situation itself was so dangerous. It was because she remembered the submarine game that she and Joe used to play when they were little. More specifically, she remembered the very last time they ever played it. Joe had been about 4 years old. The two of them had just finished another one of their make-believe missions, and they were supposed to be bringing their imaginary submarine back up to the surface. But then, Joe had suddenly dropped his homemade wooden periscope. He turned to Florence and said something so strange and so haunting for such a young child that Florence had never forgotten it. She had asked him to explain what he meant, but he had refused. In fact, after that day, he refused to play the submarine game ever again. Now, Florence hadn't thought about that strange moment in years. But now, seeing what was happening to her brother, it was all she could think about. A couple of days later, on December 22nd, 5 days after the submarine had sunk, Florence received the official word. Her brother Joe and all the other sailors trapped in the torpedo room had died while waiting to be rescued. Florence was completely grief-stricken. This was her baby brother, and he had just died in this horrible, drawn-out way. But also, strangely, for the first time in her life, she felt like she actually understood what Joe had said all those years ago when he was just 4 years old when they had played that last game of submarine. On that day, after dropping his periscope, he had turned to Florence and said, quote, "All hands were lost." It's an expression used in the Navy to mean that everybody on board a ship has died. He was saying their make-believe submarine had just sunk, and everyone on board had died. And remember, after he said this, Florence had tried to get 4-year-old Joe to explain, but he wouldn't. And he never played the game again. So now, in hindsight, Florence believed that her 4-year-old brother, all those years ago, had somehow predicted his own death. On the evening of the 19th of April, 1989, a 62-year-old man named Thomas Meehan was sitting in his living room in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was relaxing, watching some television, when his phone rang. Thomas picked it up and said hello. He heard the voice of his daughter Patricia on the other end of the line. And right away he could tell from the tone of her voice that she was feeling really down. This didn't really surprise him. Patricia was 37 years old, and Thomas knew she had been struggling a lot lately. She lived almost 2,000 miles away from him in Bozeman, Montana, where she worked as a ranch hand. She liked her job, for the most part, mainly because she absolutely loved animals. But she had a really hard time getting along with people. She was lonely. She didn't have a lot of close friends. On top of that, she had recently been through a tough breakup. And even though she had always wanted kids, she had never had any of her own. To her father, it seemed like his daughter was going through a classic midlife crisis. So, as Thomas was on the phone, listening to his daughter make small talk about her life, he decided to cut through it. He just asked her, "Hey, what's going on?" How are you really doing? Patricia paused for a moment. Then, she vaguely said that she was just under a lot of stress. She told him she was thinking about quitting her job and moving away from Bozeman. She then asked her dad if he would be okay with her coming to Pittsburgh, maybe moving back in with him for a while. Thomas adored his daughter, and he felt for everything she was going through. So, without a moment's hesitation, he told her, of course. Of course she could come home anytime she wanted. Hearing this definitely seemed to lighten Patricia's mood. She told her dad that she would call him back the next day to make more solid plans. And then she said she loved him, and she hung up the phone. But the next day, Thomas did not get a call from Patricia. In fact, he never got another call from his daughter ever again. The following day, April 20th, at about 8:15 inches the evening, something strange happened 1,500 miles away from Thomas's house in Pittsburgh. A woman named Carol Heights was driving down a very isolated two-lane highway in the rural town of Circle, Montana. It was dark and cold outside. The only thing Carol could see was the red taillights of the one car driving in front of her. Beyond that, on either side of the highway, there was just big, empty fields stretching out into the darkness. But then, out of nowhere, the car in front of her, which had been driving along at a steady speed, suddenly swerved off the road. For a second, Carol was just confused. Why would they do that? What caused that car to suddenly veer out of the way? But then, a split second later, Carol understood exactly what had happened. Because right in front of her, in her lane, was another car driving the wrong way, barreling straight towards her. Carol jammed on her brakes and tried to swerve out of the way, just like the car in front of her had done. But she wasn't fast enough. The other car smashed into her, basically head-on. Carol felt her head snap back against the seat. There was a deafening, metallic crunching sound, and then everything went black. Just a couple of minutes later, Carol opened her eyes. She realized she had survived the crash. She felt a sharp pain in her neck, and her car was a complete mess. The airbags had deployed. It was obvious she'd been in a very serious wreck, but she was alive. Eventually, Carol managed to push her door open and climb out of the car. Her first thought was to check on the other driver. The other car was smashed right up against hers, and she couldn't see if the person inside was okay. So she got out and started walking over to the other vehicle. But before she could reach it, the driver of the other car also climbed out. In the combined glare of both cars' headlights, Carol could see that the other person was a middle-aged woman. She appeared to have shoulder-length strawberry blonde hair. And this woman, she didn't seem to be hurt, at least not visibly. In fact, what was really weird was that she seemed very, very calm. This woman just stood there by her wrecked car, not saying a single word to Carol. She didn't acknowledge what she had just done, which was drive the wrong way down a highway and smash head-on into Carol's car, nearly killing her. There was no recognition of that at all. Instead, she just stood there. And then, eventually, she turned and just stared directly at Carol. This was starting to get very alarming for Carol. It caused her to stop in her tracks and just stand there as well, staring back at this woman, not really sure what to do or say. And as Carol was waiting to see what would happen next, the other driver, this middle-aged woman, simply turned and started walking away. At this point, Carol yelled out to her to stop. She shouted that she couldn't go, that they had just been in a horrible accident, and they had to wait for the police to get there. She couldn't just leave the scene. But the woman didn't even look back. She just calmly walked off the highway, climbed over a wire fence into one of those big empty fields on the side of the road, and just kept on walking until Carol couldn't see her anymore. She had just vanished into the darkness. When the police arrived about 45 minutes later at 9 p.m., they found the two wrecked cars and a very shaken Carol. The other driver, as Carol explained, was gone. So the police ran the license plate of the car that had hit Carol's. They learned that it was registered to a 37-year-old woman named Patricia Meehan. But beyond the fact that Patricia had apparently just walked away from the crash, the other weird thing was that the registration showed she lived 400 miles away. The police had no idea what she was even doing all the way out here in Circle, Montana. Patricia did not come back to the crash site. So eventually, the police called in K9 units and they began searching for her. The dogs were able to pick up her trail. They found a line of her footprints leading out into that dark field. They followed that trail for hours and hours, deep into the empty landscape. But eventually, the footprints just stopped, and the dogs lost her scent. The police would continue looking for her, but they never found another trace of Patricia. It really was like she had just wandered into that field and vanished into thin air. But that was not the end of the story. About 2 weeks later, a totally unrelated police officer was eating at a fast food restaurant in Luverne, Minnesota. This was about 700 miles away from the crash site. Now, even though this officer lived and worked in a completely different state, he had actually heard about Patricia Meehan's disappearance. He'd seen pictures of her, because by this point, her case had become national news. So, when this officer looked across the restaurant he was in and saw a middle-aged woman with strawberry blonde hair sitting in a booth all by herself, silently drinking a glass of water and just staring off into space, he immediately thought it was Patricia. The police officer had no idea if this really was her. He was pretty confident it was, but it just seemed so random and so bizarre that she would be here, of all places. He also didn't know if she was alone or what she was doing. So, instead of getting up and talking to her, he decided to just stay in his seat and keep an eye on her. And for the next 5 hours, the woman he believed was Patricia just sat there in the booth. She slowly drank water and stared off into space for 5 straight hours. Eventually, the restaurant closed for the night. An employee had to go over and tell the woman that she had to leave. They also told the officer that he too had to go. So after the officer and the woman he thought was Patricia had left the restaurant, the officer kind of hung back and continued to watch her. And she just walked right across the street and went into a diner that was open all night. This time, the officer did not keep his distance. He went inside the diner, walked right over to where she was sitting at a table, and he sat down next to her. He just said, "What's your name?" For a moment, the woman seemed kind of confused, like she couldn't understand why a random police officer was sitting with her. But instead of challenging him, she just went quiet for a second. And then, in a sort of hushed voice, she said that she was from Colorado. But then a moment later, she shook her head and said, "Actually, no. I'm from Israel." And before she could give up any more information, like her name or why she was there, she suddenly jumped up out of her seat and ran outside. The police officer was caught off guard. He was a little slow to get up and chase after her. He ran outside too, but by the time he got out there, she had disappeared again. Over the next month or so, the police in charge of Patricia's case received dozens of reports just like this one. They came from people who believed they had seen Patricia at restaurants and truck stops all over America. And the police actually confirmed many of these sightings. They believed that these witnesses really did see Patricia, that it wasn't just some look-alike. And in every single case, the witnesses reported the same thing. This woman, presumably Patricia, refused to speak and was just staring vacantly into space. She didn't seem to know who she was or what she was even doing. But also, in every one of these cases, before anybody could intervene or ask her questions or just try to help her in some way, Patricia would run off and disappear again. It was like Patricia was a ghost, appearing and disappearing over and over again all across the country. As of today, there have been over 5,000 reported sightings of Patricia Meehan. But still, we do not know where she is. Her case, to this day, is still open and unsolved. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya!